Hello. It's great to see your smiling face, and I can't believe how good you look considering the number of hours of work you've been doing each week.
I've been smashing it. So we are back again with the most popular guest on this podcast, the slinkiest Kit Laughlin. So you guys had your questions and Kit has answers. If you haven't heard already, the first interview that we did with Kit, that goes over his general philosophy and approach to training, nutrition and stretching. For me, it was a huge paradigm shift, and very much for a lot of the listeners as well. So go back and check that out if you haven't already. We'll put the link in the show notes, available on propanefitness.com/Kit Laughlin, one word. And so I've been to Kit's workshops, read his books, and they are all comprehensive resources. There is no stone left unturned. He absolutely dives into the topics at hand. So Kit, thanks for coming back with us.
It's a great pleasure, Yusef. I mean that, and I'm always happy to come back. And I mentioned this to you once before, but all any teacher wants is a room full of willing people, and this is just a bigger room than normal. That's all. How's your own training going? I wanted to ask you before we actually get going on the questions and answers, because you have been working so hard recently.
I have. I was in A&E a couple of weeks ago. So I've got since we last spoke, I've had an MRI for my back, and turns out I've got an L5-S1 disc herniation. And I was in A&E because I lost sensation and had paresthesia down the left side of my left leg, matching the nerve distribution of that disc.
Right. Well, that's a very, very strong correlation, isn't it? That suggests a cause.
A bit worrying, but there was no motor loss, just sensory. So they discharged me, but they said if it gets any worse, then come back. So I've had to adapt my training around that stuff at the minute. Still suffering from some sciatica.
Well, if it's any consolation to you, and you've seen how well I can move, I am absolutely certain there's pathology in my system as well. But because I've kept on doing all the things that we're recommending to our listeners and viewers, in fact, my flexibility now is actually better than it was 15 years ago. And my strength, I've been deadlifting again, remaining in deadlift is my preferred deadlift. And just by taking it easy and increasing the loads slowly and doing a fair amount of, I would call it modest intensity volume, everything seems to be excellent.
That is fantastic. Your methods do work very well for back pain as well. I mean, my sciatica kind of flared up yesterday, and I did a few of the stretches from your book. And for anyone listening, there's a flow chart of self-assessment that you can do to figure out what your specific limitations are, and you stretch through them. And I've recommended the book and the series of videos for back pain to multiple clients, and every one of them has cleared up their pain by doing the stretches in there.
Yusef, what our medical system, and I mean you're part of that too now of course, what our medical system really does not understand at a deep level is that the system that we've inherited from our evolutionary past is an immensely effective adaptation machine. Now I know you're familiar with this, the nocebo effect and the placebo effect. Most people have only heard the word placebo, but if you actually see the evidence of irreversible somatic change, like for example in your case, an extruding L5-S1 disc, for some people they adopt what the medical anthropologists call the sick role, and they actually don't get any better. They're absolved from familial responsibility, they're absolved from, or they might be entitled to compensation from work or time off from work and all those kinds of things. And the statistics for recovery from low back pain are extremely interesting. If there's not a full return to work within 12 weeks, I'll just pick it up at, I've got a couple of thoughts in my mind. Yusef, I'm just not sure that our audience realizes just the extent to which one's adaptive capacities can be gently brought to bear on a problem like the one you've just described. I mean, for most people, the idea of a bulging L5-S1 disc is, can be the kiss of death, but it's not real. The system that we live in has immense redundancy built in, and of course, when you only look at an MRI that shows a bulging disc and you can see that bulge is impinging on a nerve, it's not a big move to understand or to feel very strongly that that's actually the cause of your problem. But the whole disc vertebral structure is only one part of an extremely complex system which has many ways of adapting to that particular problem. Now, the two things that the audience should know, firstly, is that you've got a bulging disc, not an extruding disc, and so that's nowhere near as serious a problem. But a bulging disc still can press on an exiting segmental nerve, and it still can create that paresthesia that you described before, that numbness of the surface of the skin. And of course, if the symptoms get severe enough, it can also cause all sorts of neurological deficits, as they're called, as of course you know, which are things like inability to dorsiflex, or complete loss of feeling, or complete loss of action in the muscle, etc., etc. But as you know, if you survive the first 6 months of even a full-blown disc extrusion event, and there, I should say as an aside, there are two mechanisms here that cause all the pain and discomfort. One is that the freshly exiting disc material itself is a chemical irritant to the nerve sheath, but that process actually resolves itself relatively quickly, somewhere between 3 and 6 months. And this is why we say if you can walk around, even if it's uncomfortable to do, even if you're in pain doing it, you must continue to move, and you must try increasing that movement envelope on a regular basis. And the chances are, and certainly the statistics support this very strongly, the chances are if you make it through that 6-month period, you're on the road to full recovery. And the second thing is that the exiting disc material also has a mechanical effect on the nerve sheath. So there are two separate effects. The chemical one is resolved relatively quickly, and the second one, the actual physical pressure of the exiting disc material on the segmental nerve, that will cause downstream pain or sensation or loss of function somewhere downstream of where the impingement occurs, as you know. But even that will alter over time, providing you keep moving, and the reason is that disc material is resorbed into the body. But you have to use and create the movement and the physical forces against that extrusion for that to occur. If you lie down and do nothing, absolutely there's no force on the system, absolutely nothing will change.
I suppose there's a cascade of other effects as well, where you create more guarding, more threat perception, more of the kind of the psychosocial loop of movement is bad, and when I do move it causes me pain, and
it hurts,
and all of it spirals off. Yeah. And we've actually got quite a lot of questions about back pain.
Okay, let me get into it. I'll stop. Let's get straight into it.
Sure. So, first of all, thrown into the deep end, actually, Tim asks, I don't know how to formulate this into a question, but I would like Kit to talk more about the fear aspect of tightness, particularly post-injury, and what advice he has. To give some context so that he can reformulate this into something coherent, I'm currently working on opening up my hips for a sumo deadlift, but I feel like my adductors are maybe tight, such as from a fear response due to injuring my hips, having weaker glutes, and it won't loosen up until I get over that.
Well, here's the thing. The human organism is a self-referencing organism, and so if you have a deep belief that this is going to happen to you, or this is actually what's happening, it's not just a question of whether or not an independent observer would see those causal mechanisms in action or not. The fact is, the way that you're thinking about the problem is literally predisposing the outcome of any activity that you take in respect to that problem. And so it's a self-referencing loop, and the question then becomes, God, how can I step out of this loop? It's extremely subtle, because how can you? The real question is, how can I think outside the box? I have this feedback coming from my body, which says, when I do get into this position, this hurts, or this movement feels like it can't open up. I'm experiencing fear in my body, and I'm thinking about what is underneath that, and of course what's underneath that is I'm terrified about hurting myself. This is real. So that's the mechanism of what's actually happening, and of course as I said, it's extremely hard to get past that. So here, in short, in brief, are the techniques that we have found to be extremely helpful. Firstly, it's necessary to understand that the protective mechanism first, and the fear underneath that, is hardwired in your body. It's called the fight or flight response. Now, a lot of people, and guys like Hans Selye, that Canadian doctor who wrote the most brilliant book on the subject called The Stress of Life, all medicine has concentrated on is the actual corticosteroid response of the fight or flight mechanism. But no one has written about what else goes on at the same time. Any time the fight or flight mechanism is triggered, your body's tension increases. It is never the case that your human body, or any body, any mammalian body, responds to any threat by relaxing, opening and lengthening. It's never happened on the planet. It is always closing, guarding, protecting, and tightening down, protecting throat, gut, groin, the big three areas in the human body. So how do we get past this? Firstly, by recognizing that this is a natural response, that should decrease the fear dimension of it. Secondly, whenever you're in the face of that physical tension, you need to apply a stress of a calculated size. It must be enough to move the system to a new developmental trajectory, but at the same time it can't be too much because the system will shut you down. And so we are literally playing the razor's edge of too much and not enough. And so what we do is we go into the position, whatever it is that we're talking about. Let's say in respect of a sumo deadlift, we might be talking about the squash frog or the tailor pose, some exercise that opens up the adductors but with the knees bent. So we're only talking about the adductors that occur between the pelvis and above the knee. And we get into a position where we experience the tension in those muscles. And then we do something which is definitely not hardwired in the system, but which is absolutely necessary. You take in a deep breath and you literally let the body go soft. Now we've just come out of a workshop in London. It was just so amusing. I'd walk up to this guy, let's say it's a guy, it could have been a girl, and I would say, are you relaxed? And the guy would say, yeah, sure, I'm completely relaxed. They're in the stretch, let's say they're in a lunge hamstring stretch or something. And I say, well, just a second. I reach down and I feel their tummy, and the tummy is completely rigid. And this is the key thing, Yusef, those people believe that they're relaxed, and if you have not actually had the experience in your body of being deeply relaxed, that will be your version of relaxed. But in fact, it's not real. And so when you do actually physically say, okay, I'm going to let my tummy go soft, which is a deliberate choice of taking tension away from an area, all of a sudden the tension in the muscle group that we're talking about, in this case the adductors, goes down. And it may not be a huge decrease in the beginning, but it goes down. Then you take in another breath. You put all of your awareness in the muscle group that you're trying to lengthen, and you make sure that any lengthening or any stretching occurs during the period of the breath out. Now this might sound way too specific, but let me explain what I mean. If you try this both ways and you try lengthening a muscle while you're holding your breath, or when you breathe out and the breath has stopped moving, if you try to lengthen during that period, you'll find the lengthening effect is reduced immensely. If, for example, you're doing a stretch and you find that you run out of time, as in you breathe out but you know you can still go further, stop moving when you breathe out, take in another breath, check to see that you haven't tightened up in the process, and then once again, as you start to breathe out, let your whole body go limp and try to move a bit more deeply into the range of movement. If you can do that, you will always get more movement.
I think this runs up against the typical way that people stretch, and it certainly changed the way that I stretch, which is set a timer for 30 seconds, grit as hard as you can, and just go for it until you can't handle it anymore. And yeah, very rarely do you gain any range of motion unless it's just by pure attrition. And the other point you mentioned as well about the relaxed abdomen, I think maybe 80% of the people listening, if they're sat in their car or sat listening to this, probably realised that they were holding tension in their abdomen even when you think that you're relaxed. And it's crazy because we're not under a physical threat, but we do just have these resting tensions that we only realise when we tune in. So I suppose the 3 points there for Tim. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. I was just going to say, we do have a whole bunch of free relaxation audio recordings on our site. And people are, we love you to use them. I'm going to just say this before you sum up the 3 points for Tim. Unless you have the direct experience in your body and your mind of what being deeply relaxed feels like, it's just like whistling at the moon. You can tell yourself to relax, you can tell yourself to let yourself go soft, you can do all these other things, and it's a game you're playing with yourself. If you cannot recreate that sensation of being deeply relaxed in the moment, you haven't got it. And so the reason we use the lying relaxations as the way into this is that for most Westerners in particular, and look, the whole of life is conspiring to take your attention from what's happening inside you. I mean, the iPhone generation, the fact that we're on the internet now, the fact that you're sitting in your car as a listener listening to a podcast, I mean, the whole thing is so completely unreal. But we live in a world where we are bombarded with competing stimulation, and we have to make choices between these things, not realizing that there's other choices that can be made too, like not tuning in. Anyway, given that we are, at least we hope we are trying to use this medium as a means of helping people to, I don't like the word cope with their life better. We really should be saying to help people feel more comfortable about living their life and being happier about living their life, then I think that's a legitimate use of the technology. But anyway, you were going to sum up the 3 things for Tim.
Sure, so many ideas now, but yeah, so Tim, I guess there it's bring awareness to the area, apply a calculated stress to that area that's only slightly beyond the current range, and then on the exhale learn to breathe out into that and to lengthen on each exhale. And if you find that you could go further, take another breath, hold steady, and then go for a further breath.
While you're breathing out, do the further movement. And the absolutely key thing, which is actually a new part of our work, it's only probably a year old now, is every time before you're about to re-stretch something, do check in to see whether your tummy is tight or not. 99 times out of 100 it will be. And by just letting it go soft, which of course is the antithesis of the buff body, right? So there's this other thing happening in the mind here. Let yourself go, apart from whatever you're using as tension to hold yourself in the position that a stretch requires, all other tension, let it go completely. Let your tummy go soft. If you're working with someone, ask them to press your tummy gently, and you'll be thinking that you're relaxing, but as soon as you feel someone pressing on your tummy, you'll think, oh, actually, yeah, I can relax more. Everything that you can do to relax more, including using the relaxation scripts at another time, will help this project.
So I've actually used your relaxation scripts. You have one for back pain that I've been listening to every night, and it is fantastic, and it is a skill that you get better at. And I think initially it is frustrating when you expect it to be an easy task, but actually, because it's not something that we're used to cultivating, it does take some time, but I've been getting better over the months.
Good. Well, look, let me just make a brief side comment on that. Our species, talking now about Homo sapiens, we are the result of thousands of generations of mammals who were immensely capable at mobilizing the fight or flight response. And we are, on the planet even now, we're the supreme killers. I mean, that's a terrible thing to say, but it's also real. It's true. Human beings are always at war with one another. The things that humans seem to be able to do the most effectively is kill other human beings, etc., etc. But here's the thing. That's a sympathetic nervous response, as you know from your study. And up until now, there has never been a powerful reason to develop the opposite response, called the relaxation response, and that's mediated through the parasympathetic nervous system, as you know, which literally switches all of those switches in the other direction. It is not natural for human beings to be relaxed. I agree with that completely, but I will also say that being able to relax when you want to is simply another skill which you can develop. We say if you want to be able to relax, you've got to commit yourself to practicing for a month, but then we say if you're really serious about making a change to yourself, you've got to practice for 3 months. If you do daily practice of those relaxation scripts for 3 months, you will literally be a different person at the end of that period.
Something I've been considering doing actually is just substituting out my daily meditation practice just for 3 to 6 months and just doing the yoga nidra, the progressive relaxation, and then maybe coming back to the other practices later. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think that's extremely wise, and let me just enlarge the context of this conversation, because many of your listeners are people who do powerlifting or other sorts of lifting, like Olympic lifting or bodybuilding, anyway, some kind of strong resistance training, and some of your students also are involved in gymnastic strength training, right?
Sure.
I think that's correct, isn't it? So what we say to people, I mean, you can imagine all the people that come to our workshops, especially the stretch therapy for performance workshops, they are all interested in improving their range of movement. They want to be able to do those key end positions like pancake or pike or full back bend and all those kinds of things. And so what they've learned is that they can't actually progress their movement skill work beyond a certain point, because they simply don't have the range of movement, or they don't have the capacity to activate the muscles on the inside of the joint to further compress the movement or further tighten up the movement. And so they say, well, how are we going to work this new training into our existing strength training? And for many people it would be a much, much better solution to do strength training of any sort once a week only, and do the 2 other training sessions that they're doing, or however many that they're doing, concentrating on movement and mobility. The one strength training session a week will maintain at least 80% of wherever you are now. I know the research doesn't support this, but I absolutely assure you this is true. We've coached thousands of people, and this is their experience. If you do one strong strength training session a week, you can maintain a significant fraction of your best ever strength, and in the meantime you then do other mobilization, or limbering we call it, and perhaps 1 or 2 strong stretching sessions a week on your worst areas. And the progress that you'll make once you get past that 3 months or 6 months and you go back to doing your ordinary strength training, and then use the flexibility work as a kind of a maintenance thing, so you turn these priorities around, your progress in the strength training will be phenomenally faster.
This is something that a lesson that I've been very glad to have learned over the last couple of years, is that even if you do have to pull back on the strength training for some time due to injury or whatever, it comes back. And the fear of not being at peak performance all the time is completely irrational. And as our friend Mark pointed out, he's a strength coach for the Edinburgh rugby team, he said there is no other type of athlete apart from powerlifters that expect to be performing at maximal loads all the time throughout the year, and saying that actually we should be taking a complete off season doing stuff that is non-spinal loading related entirely, you know, swimming and single leg work and yoga and all that stuff, and then come back to it.
Absolutely. Look, that guy, I can't remember where he come from. Is he Romanian or Czech? I'm not sure. Tudor Bompa, Bompa, the author who wrote the original book Periodization.
Oh, okay.
A brilliant piece of work. He talks about microcycles, mesocycles, and macrocycles. Everything in this world operates on cycles. It's only the human ego that wants to be performing at top levels all the time. It's ridiculous. You know, what's the good book say? We have a time to sow and a time to reap. You know,
that's it.
Everything
but
goes inside.
It's so easy to get sucked into the PB mindset every time, from session to session, not actually looking at the big picture, for sure. Something you mentioned as well, Kit, about the relaxation response. I just listened to an audio summary of it the other day, and interesting. I didn't realize that it was discovered in the same building as the scientist who came up with the stress response, or the fight-flight response. Pretty cool.
Isn't that fun?
Yeah, excellent. So you also said something about the world conspiring to steal your attention span, or to take your attention away from what's going on inside. I can't remember if it was you that mentioned this last time, but it was someone said this comparison of the average adult attention span from, say, 1990 to the current day, and it's something like 14 minutes, and now it's like 11 seconds. It's absolutely...
I was going to say it won't even be 14 seconds. I mean, if you watch how people... Well, there's been many studies done on this recently, but watch people's clicking activity. if something is not happening within the first few seconds, you click away to something else. Well, look, Abraham Lincoln, and we're going back a long time now, but Abraham Lincoln, when he was doing his stump performances to try and get elected, when he was trying to become president of the United States, he would speak, or his opponent would speak. Firstly, people walked everywhere in those days. So farmers, these people who were flogging themselves, working from dawn to dusk every day, they would walk 10, 15, 20 miles to a town hall to listen to these guys speak. The opponent would speak for 4 hours without notes, and then Abraham Lincoln would reply without notes to the points that he made in his... So we're talking 8 hours of conversation. I mean,
what a monster.
People today simply cannot conceive of what that might feel like. And these farmers walked, and their wives walked all of these miles, or rode horses, most of them walked, and they were still capable of maintaining that attention. They thought that was important enough to actually sacrifice rest for that. Look, yes, look, it's not just Facebook. In Singapore recently, and also in London here now, which is where I am, we are seeing an increasing number of people, instead of walking and strolling around and actually being aware of their surroundings. I'm sure you've seen this a million times. Now it's common to see people walking along, holding a phone, only peripherally aware of the people, the crowd that they're
right into a lamppost.
Right into a lamppost. I mean, we just hope it happens more often. I know it sounds very cruel. It is cruel. But I remember that famous video of that African-American woman who was reading something on her phone and who walked into a fountain. It went viral.
I think there's quite a few, yeah.
Yes, it's just so funny, but it's sad and funny. But what is interesting to me is, Olivia and I were in New York last year, and we were having dinner in one of those sports bars. This exemplifies what I'm talking about and what you're talking about. There were 6 people who'd come from a local business. They all had their T-shirts on. 6 people had come for a drink and something to eat after work. A convivial little social atmosphere. Each person was on their phone to someone else who wasn't there. And then every now and again, if they found something particularly funny or interesting on Facebook, they'd laugh and show their phone to the other people at about that speed and then go back to the conversation. They were together but completely absent from one another. To me, this seems absurd.
I think there was a study saying that social interactions are rated as less authentic or less, there's less connection, even if a phone is on the table in sight but not in use. And then obviously if it's in use, it drops even further.
Yeah.
And so sorry, go ahead.
And so here's so now I've interrupted you, forgive me, but the key thing is this. At some point, each of us has to wake up and say, shit, what actually do I want from my life? What do I want? Life isn't just something that happens to you. It's actually what happens when you're not paying attention to it. And then you describe that, this is my life. No, it doesn't have to be like that. The question that we ask all of our students at different junctures is, at some point, what do you want? What do you want? And for many people, when you ask them that question, it's a terribly confronting question, isn't it? Because most people have no clue. But the mere asking of that question provokes all sorts of internal things starting.
So Jordan Peterson talks about this, where he says that people are afraid to set specific goals because as soon as they do, that immediately sets up a criteria for failure, and no one wants to have to face that. So they would rather have an open-ended idea of what success means to them, so that there's no chance of having to fail.
And Yusef, the tragedy of this is it's a complete misunderstanding of the learning process, because, and I know that you know this, you learn more from failing, or learn more about what doesn't work by trying something and then coming to a point saying, okay, that didn't work, that's fine, no problem. Yes, you could look at it as failure, but that's only because our system is set up to reward only success. But the real learning in this life, in everyone's life, this has always been the case, and it will always be the case, no matter what spin you put on the process. It's only when you play with things and tinker with things and you find out, oh, that is not giving me the result that I want, okay, just put that aside, have a think about how, here I am, I'm at this point here, I want to get to there, what other options can I generate that might take me part of the way there, and try it, and if it doesn't work, you try something else. That's how learning actually happens. It is nothing like the myth, the story of learning that we get given in schools, where we're only rewarded for being successful. That's ridiculous. We should be pleased, immensely pleased when we fail, because we now have a certain understanding that that route, that road, that path, that technology, that technique is not effective for me right now. That's gold, man.
Well, learning is always a painful process. You have to destroy your existing axiomatic structures to create new ones, and so even small lessons are painful to learn. But it was, I think, again, Jordan Peterson saying, the larger the structure that has to be destroyed, the more painful the learning process. And if you find that your partner is cheating on you, then there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to crumble and be rebuilt to recreate your perception of reality, because clearly the one that you'd built wasn't correct.
And in fact, I mean, the Buddhists are eloquent on this subject. Absolutely everything you think in your mind is not actually true. I mean, of course, we're talking to each other on Skype, so we're assuming that the long chains of reasoning that have led to the development of the technology that we're using are not suddenly going to change in the next heartbeat. But if they do, I'll call you back. Do you know what I mean? What I'm talking about and what you're talking about, and I don't actually agree with you about learning having to be painful. That makes it sound so negative. I'm being completely honest with you. I'm not putting a Pollyanna spin on this at all. For me, I love failing, and I don't mean that in a stupid, silly way. Of course, if something really goes wrong, like I trip and fall down the stairs and break something, I'm not going to be elated with glee about that. But the difference between my approach to all of the things we're talking about and most other people that I come in contact with is that I don't have any illusions about.
I think that's it. It's proportional to how rigid your existing structures are and how painful it would be to break them down. And if you don't have too much emotional investment in those existing paradigms, then learning is a flow.
I'm actually paying attention, Yusef, to what's actually happening. Not what I think is happening. This is the key. It's such. You've got a meditation practice, and I'm sure many of our listeners will have practices like that, or at least be thinking that would be something good to engage in at some point. Well, my strong recommendation would be to engage in it right now, or today anyway, and just put aside 5 minutes. You don't need to do much. Even 5 minutes of sitting still and doing nothing is immensely rejuvenating. It's hard to... I know that the mind contemplating that statement will say something like, oh God, 5 minutes can't be any use at all. It can't have any effect. It's not long enough. That's the mind's perception of what the experience will be. It's not actually what happens if you sit down for 5 minutes and do nothing. And so most of us are living this life by projecting our mind's model of the future into the immediate or medium future, or we have a model of ourselves, a view of ourselves, which is constrained by all the things that have happened to us in the past, and that model is controlling your experience of now. Both are false. If you can actually take a breath, relax completely, and try to see and experience with as little filtration as possible what's actually happening now, you will start to see more clearly. And this too, just like relaxing, is just a habit. Most of us have a stronger engagement with the processes between our ears, and we mistake what our thoughts are for reality. We believe that our thoughts are reality. They are not. Reality is conditioned by your thinking process to an immense degree. That's actually what this tattoo is about on my arms. We've spoken about this before.
Can you see the tattoo?
Sure, I don't know whether you can see it, but it's in Sanskrit, or Pali actually, but they look very similar. In the Buddhist system of thinking, and this is completely different to our Western perspective on this, the mind, that's the first line of the Dhammapada, one of the most famous sutras in the Buddhist world, and the first line says, the mind is chief, then the next line, among the senses. So what that means is, even the way you see and the way you hear is being constructed and constrained by the mind. And so the scientific fiction is that when we all look out the window, we have so many angstroms or whatever we measure wavelengths of light in impinging on the retina, and, so the fiction goes, the mind will actually see what's on the retina. That's not actually what happens. I look out the window and I'm thinking about chlorophyll action in green leaves or whatever. You look out the window and you see a pretty girl walking past. It's the same wavelengths of light hitting the retina, but the mind is carving the reality it's experiencing up preconceptually. That's how deep this goes. And so, I'm skating over a lot of chasms here, but the whole meditation project, it has one goal which is never spoken about clearly enough in my view. The goal is to see and experience reality directly. Now, no one does that, but that is actually the goal, and you can have glimpses of it, and most people have had glimpses of it. So the practice of meditation and the many steps and sub-steps and the many ideas that are being used to help you improve your practice, and I'll talk about that a bit more later, all of those things are actually about how to take the filters away, how to reduce the construction mechanism of the mind in its apprehension of reality. Now look, I don't know whether we're getting way too far off the topic here for the listeners, but
this is the literal translation of Vipassana, isn't it? To see things clearly.
The problem, Vipassana, what does it mean literally? Let me just think, passaddhi, to know. I can't remember, it's not coming to my mind immediately.
I thought it was just to see reality as it is, or
that's a transliteration. It's not the actual exact words. I think, and look, well, let's just check. I'll come back to you on that one because I have a friend who's a Pali scholar. But Vipassana, the term, is what's used, or our expression in English, insight meditation, is used to describe or to explain what the term Vipassana means. But I think Vipassana means to see or to know. It's one of the. It's very close to what you said. And let us say, regardless of, and let's say there's some linguist in the audience who will tell us, no, we've got it completely wrong. Nonetheless, the gloss over the precise meaning of that, and the if you like, the truth that sits behind the name Vipassana, or in my case, the speciality that I have is the other wing of the bird of meditation called samatha, because samatha and Vipassana were both taught by the Buddha at the same time, but Vipassana has captured the Western imagination because it's actually a process done by the mind, whereas samatha is a process done by the body. My recommendation for most people is that samatha is actually the better stream in the beginning because it's also about relaxation and connecting to sensation.
Definitely agreed. I think throwing someone straight into Vipassana straight away is very hard to stay on track. I think you need a basis of concentration first.
Yes, well, there's a sutra called the Satipatthana Sutra. The first Satipatthana is the body, and Satipatthana means foundation of mindfulness. And so, this is the way that I've been taught and the way that we teach when we're teaching in monasteries in Malaysia, for example. The body is with you all the time. You're sitting there listening to me talk. If part of your awareness is also feeling what's actually happening in your body, breakfast progress and all the other things that are happening in the body, or maybe you've been sitting here for a bit too long and your bum's becoming a bit numb or whatever is happening, part of your attention being in the body will ground you always. When we talk about being grounded, that's actually literally what we mean. It means being, instead of attention only being on what's happening between the ears or the thought stream, actually experiencing what's happening in the body immediately brings you into the present, because physical sensations only happen in the continuously unfolding present. You can't project physical sensations into the future. You can't project them into the past. They're only now. And so this is the reason why the Buddha spoke about using the body as the first foundation of mindfulness, because one, it's there with you all the time, and two, it exists only in the present. That's immensely powerful.
This is the basis behind your approach as well, in that you work into the body and then you generate more awareness that can be brought up into the mind. One final thought, I guess, before we go way too off-piste, is just what you said about Abraham Lincoln traveling and listening to a talk for 4 hours, and it's that the instruction of meditation, even the basics that you've described there, I think in the world of the fact that this is one podcast of millions that people can listen to,
yes.
the information becomes so in high supply that we don't realize the value of a gift of being told something like that, compared to hundreds of years ago where people would travel far and wide to listen to a third-hand passed down instruction of someone saying, watch the breath, and that's all they would say, and then they would go away and do it for years because that information was so valuable that it was all they could access. And
yes.
Whereas now I think people they'll see stuff about meditation and think, oh, okay, I'll give it a shot for 5 minutes. Oh, I didn't do anything, I don't feel enlightened, okay, like sack this, I'm just gonna do what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's it. Look, I mean, really the key point of that, of what you just said, is that our expectations of immediate gratification, which of course are reinforced by the internet, 10,000 times a day, those expectations are unrealistic. If for example, I don't know how old you are, let's say you're 30, let's say you're 30 years of age, you have spent, since you started to become aware of yourself, and let's say it's around 8 or 9 years of age, something like that, you have built up a formidable ego structure. And that tends to run the show in most people, especially when we're tired or frustrated or annoyed or whatever. Under pressure in any case. That tends to take over. A tiny, tiny glimpse of stillness allows you to pull back from the pressure and the force of that. So everything in your life, or everything in everyone's life, is combining and creating the effect of more and more urgency, shorter and shorter attention spans, a feeling of, I've got so much more to do, I have to do this by the end of the day, and I'm feeling an immense amount of pressure because of X, Y, and Z, and everyone can always tell you why they're upset or why they're whatever. But none of it is real. Literally none of it is real. And in my view, at least anyway, one of the great values of a relaxation practice, and I put relaxation practice and meditation practice side by side, I don't privilege one over the other, is basically to experience yourself directly. And when you do experience yourself, when you are in tune with what's happening inside your own body, you'll suddenly see, while I'm not thinking about something, while my awareness is actually on what's happening in my body, in this exact moment there are no problems. Now that doesn't mean that, when people say that, critics will say, oh, you still got to pay the rent. Yes, of course you still have to pay the rent. And because of your past choices, like for you, for example, you're a resident now, the past choices that you made that have led to your current cycle of being a resident and the things that happen to your back and so on and so forth, those things are real in that sense, but they're also not the only option that's available to you at any given time. When we're in a cycle, we always think, oh my God, I can't get out, I can't escape. That's not true. Even a small amount of relaxation or meditation practice each day will actually give you respite, even while you're the busiest, I suppose, that you've ever been, actually. Right?
You've convinced me. I'm gonna sub out my meditation practice for a while and report back with the results.
Yeah, and the thing is that the awareness that you bring to the relaxation practice and the way that will change the mind's relationship to the body, when you go back to practicing the meditation again, formally sitting and all the rest of it, it will just be that much clearer. It's definitely not a misdirection. It is the same project, actually. It's a different version of it. Look, I'll just touch on a couple of notes here, and I'll be as brief as possible. There's a sutra where my friend Patrick, who's the Pali scholar, has not been able to find it, but the Buddha said there are two wings to the bird of meditation. He's speaking about Vipassana and Samatha. And then the next line is, and the bird of meditation needs two wings to fly. It's so obvious when it's said that way. Having said that, the Satipatthana Sutta also talks about the different kinds of students. There are some students who are attracted to Vipassana, and that's perfectly
I think we should just clarify for the listeners, by the way, if you're wondering, samatha is concentration-based practices, so focusing on the breath, and vipassana is what's commonly been termed mindfulness, where it's open floodlight focus on everything that passes through awareness.
There are many, many different spins on vipassana. Some's open awareness and some are much more narrowly focused. But yes, basically it's about observing the thought stream. But samatha, S-M-A-S-A-M-A-T-H-A, samatha is the part of the meditation project that the Tibetans took on, and they call it calm abiding meditation now, and they've developed a whole thing around that. But the practices that are even more fundamental than that for Westerners, in my view at least anyway, are the relaxation practices which the yogis called yoga nidra, you referred to before. That's just a question of lying down with your palms facing up, or the shavasana, the course poses, you know, and simply becoming aware of, and in our relaxation practices we direct awareness to the sensations of breathing, or the movements in the body we call breathing. We also do visualizations of different parts of the body. We also do different breath control techniques. We also do, sometimes we do some contractions and some relaxations in the early parts so people can feel the difference between tension and letting go of tension. They are guided visualizations which are designed, and they are effective in this very much. They're designed to allow you at some point to become aware, oh, I'm deeply relaxed now. That's what they're for. Some of them are short, some of them are 10 minutes long, some of them are long, 40 minutes long. It doesn't matter which ones you're attracted to, which ones you do, and this is I'll now go back to the original sutta. It doesn't matter whether you do samatha or vipassana, or there's a couple of other methods that they talk about, they all lead to the same end point. That's the key. It doesn't matter which way you go. So if you find that you are attracted to one, not vipassana over the other, no problem. Eventually the other thing will establish itself anyway. I don't want to get too technical about this because this is so far and away from what we've said we're going to talk about, which is Tim's hip problem. But it is all related.
That is hilarious. Yeah. Fine. Well, we can always take this section and put it at the end after the FAQs.
Sure.
Yeah, I've just finished a book by Daniel Ingram called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. This is a emergency medicine physician in America who'd spent 14 years doing intensive practice on and off around work and doing long retreats, and became an arhat, or enlightened, having done that for so long. And yeah, it's a very rigorous and no bullshit book. It's not exactly a literary masterpiece, but it's very very cutting and sort of quite dismissive of a lot of the tradition that comes with meditation. And he's very much about just stick with the practice. And he talks about, as you said,
let me interrupt
sure.
you because, and hold on to that thought, please. This is tremendously important. Buddhism is a religion in Thailand. It's actually the state religion, the country's religion, but it's not a religion. The practice as taught by the Buddha is an absolutely, utterly empirical approach. He says this is just a method. If you practice it, and there's all sorts of things that can happen as you practice, and when this happens, do this, and when that happens, do something else. If you practice this, in the Satipatthana Sutta, he describes the road as a one-way road. If you keep practicing, it will lead to this end point, as your author Daniel described, and it's inevitable. That's what people don't realize, and it's a system. You take nothing on faith. In fact, the Buddha was eloquent on this. Take nothing on faith. Don't even take what I say on faith. Simply, here are a set of instructions, try them and see what happens to you. That's it. Now and I've heard people on retreats say, oh, it can't be that simple. That's what the mind does. The mind's job is to create problems and come up with reasons why something won't work. Forget all that. And as Daniel says, just sit down and do the practice. Of course, that's not exotic enough for a lot of people.
I think that's exactly it. And he talks about the pitfalls people fall into, or things that their minds do to take them to do anything but the practice. And he says even on 10-day retreats, he says there are people who will sit there and they're basically comparing robes and incense and just steeping in their neuroses and using the guru as a psychotherapist rather than, he said, I was sat there at one point, I just shouted out, like, is anybody actually doing the practice, or are we all just sat here fucking masturbating? So it's
if I'd been there, I just would have clapped. Look, this is so absolutely spot on. A very famous Tibetan Rinpoche, Trogdam Trungpa Rinpoche, you've probably heard of him. He wrote a book called Spiritual Materialism. And so unfortunately in our world way too many people are at the robed and incense and chanting stage, and they've got the right purba, those triangular knives that the Tibetans use in their rituals, and they've got all the gear. They know all about it. They know all about the practices. They can talk about the practices for hours, but Yusef, if the practice has not changed you at a fundamental level, you've been wasting your time. That's spiritual materialism. Spiritual materialism is knowing all about a practice, and yet it has not changed you. If you're doing any practice, and this goes for flexibility, it goes for strength training, meditation, relaxation, anything, if it's not being effective, and there are all sorts of ways we can assess effectiveness, you're doing the wrong practice, or you're not doing the practice. Most times you're not doing the practice as the instructions are given. That's all.
All the gear and no idea. And we see the same in powerlifting as well, for example, where you get people that have got all the latest sleeves and expensive belts and singlet and all this. Yeah. And you're like, what are your lifts? And they're terrible. And you just think, maybe do away with all of the expensive stuff and just follow a single progression program for 3 years, 5 years, and then come back and earn the right to get the equipment and to worry about daily undulating periodization and all this stuff.
Oh, I could not agree more. Look, I'll just give a brief story from my own life. There was a period, at some time, I think it was about 10 years ago now, I think I mentioned this to you in another conversation, but I was struck down by a mystery virus. I still don't have any idea what it was. But I was in intensive care for 10 days, and my C-reactive protein scores were over 325. I was extremely ill. Now, the doctors who were doing their best that they could to treat me at the time afterwards told me that for most patients, if you get C-reactive protein scores of over 325, which are measures of internal infection, you die from multiple organ failure. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what I was told. But here's the thing. When I came out of that experience, and no one ever did find out what the virus was, and I recovered, but I spent the next 6 months doing nothing but sleeping. I slept and ate, and Olivia looked after me. And then, so now we're talking about 7 months after, to the day almost, from when I was struck down by the virus, when I was carted off to hospital, I went into the heavy weights room, the Olympic lifting room at the ANU, the gym that I was working at and where we ran our classes, and empty bar sitting on a squat rack, so 20 kilos. I got underneath the empty bar, I did four reps of the full back squat, and that flattened me for a week.
Wow.
4 reps of the empty bar. This is true. I promise you I'm not making this up. I'd gone from my body weight before the infection was about 85 kilos, and I'd gone down to 63. That happened in 2 weeks, by the way.
Okay, huge.
Massive. So then 6 months later, now I'm a kind of a flabby 68, I think, completely weak because all I've been doing was sleeping. But I just felt, okay, now I have to do something. So I got back and I trained once a week only, and I only did back squats and front squats. And I was in and out of the gym because my energy levels were so low. They used to call me the phantom trainer because I'd be in and out while the other guys were warming up. But in that 1 year, and I promise you I swear this is true, my body weight went back up to over 90 kilograms, and I managed my best ever front squat and best ever back squat, training once a week. And a very occasional second light workout. But as I mentioned, when I came out of hospital, I weighed about 63 kilograms. By the time I went back to the gym, had that first workout that laid me flat on my back for a week, the massive workout of 20 kilo back squats by 4 reps, my weight was probably 68. Anyway, in that year, doing only one workout a week, and in very occasional weeks, and when I say very occasional, I mean like 1 week in 6 or 8, occasionally having a second workout, I managed to, my body weight went up to over 92 I think it was, and I was a bit fat. I acknowledge that, but I also recorded, and remember I'm an ex-Olympic lifter and as well as an ex-power lifter, I recorded my best ever front squat and best ever back squat ever in one workout a week. And you know, you'll read all the texts online and all the so-called experts online who will say that you can't possibly get, you know, really superiorly stronger on one workout a week. That's absolute nonsense. In fact, I remember when I was powerlifting and I had a guy coach me, and he became a very well-known coach after some years after we had our interaction with one another. He and I also did only 1, 2 or 3 hour workout every Sunday.
So I remember you saying that they would describe you as the phantom, that you'd be in and out very quickly. And
in fact, I would be in and out. That's a really good point. Sorry, I neglected to elaborate on that. I'd be in and out while the guys were warming up. And when I say that, because I would start with a weight that's the right weight for me, and at that stage when I was very weak, the right weight was the empty bar. And I'd do normally between 5 and 6 sets, just progressively increasing the load each time. I'd be in and out of the gym within 25 or 30 minutes without fail. I'd have a decent rest in between each set, and I would, because I was so sick at the time, I always made sure I left with gas in the tank. I think that's a mistake that a lot of us make, is that when we feel strong, and I'm actually getting back to feeling stronger again, I'll talk about some of our other workouts in a moment. They're all bodyweight workouts while we're on the road. Olivia and I, we normally do something every day, or every second day at least. But the feeling strong and being strong are actually the same thing. Our perception, when you get under the bar and you sort of take that weight onto your upper traps, or I'm actually using a low bar technique at the moment, that's another story, and you actually feel what the weight feels like, and straight away you get feedback from the bar. I can do this, I can't do this, or this is going to be some really hard work, or, you know, am I going to hit the full bottom position today with ease or not? And all those things are proprioceptive feedback from the actual taking of the bar on your back. Anyway, feeling strong, which of course is the result of strength training, is actually what makes you strong, at least in part.
We have to drill that, I think for strength specifically, very much supported by the data that training to failure isn't necessary. I mean, it is more so for bodybuilding, but just something you mentioned before about being the kind of training with a low frequency and high intensity coming up at odds with what the data supports, or at odds with the typical rules of strength training. And there's a guy who a lot of our listeners will know, Martin Burkhan of leangains.com.
I am a fan of his, in fact.
Oh, okay, excellent.
Reading his website and his extraordinary descriptions of how he used to suffer with cutting back. Both Olivia and I, the first meal of the day is lunchtime, and the last meal of the day is well within that 8-hour window that he recommends. So normally we would be eating dinner when the sun goes down. So we only have 2 meals, don't snack, and you know, my body fat is as low as it's been for many years.
For sure. I mean, it works very well for adherence. I think the point I was going to make was just about his training, in that he trains in a way that is typically wrong for a bodybuilder. But the physique that he's built is from 2 or 3 times a week training with a very high intensity, doing low volume work. But he claims that's because of his psychological profile, that he's able to train at a higher intensity than most of his clients would, and so he doesn't train with the same frequency.
That's absolutely accurate, and in fact my experience is the stronger you get, and or the higher intensity you can make yourself use, the more recovery you need. Because you're actually, if we think of the fight or flight mechanism, you're actually eating more deeply into your reserves of adaptational energy, if you can do that. Now the majority of people, and we see this in the gym all the time, now I'm not talking about a powerlifting gym, I'm talking about a bodybuilding gym. Guys that go in there and literally have the same workout, they'll be in there 3, 4, 5 times a week, and they do not change in a year. But they're having a great time. It's a great social activity, and they're making friends, and you know, showing off their pecs and biceps usually to the girls that are in the gym. All of this is totally legitimate, but my view is that one needs to be clear about what one is doing in the gym. And if you are clear about what you're there for, and in my case it was about basically getting my life back, You want to be in and out as quickly as possible without actually rushing anything. And the research does support my next contention or my next claim, which is your testosterone levels plummet after about 40 minutes. 40 minutes of intense exercise. Now, having said that, we need to make some provisos here, because the way powerlifters train and Olympic lifters train typically is not the same as what I'm talking about now. Your average powerlifter, if he or she is training on a heavy day, they will have at least 5 minutes in between sets, right? I don't know how you train, but that's not how.
Yeah, 3 to 5 minutes.
3 to 5 minutes. And so, when I talk about 40 minutes of intensity after which the testosterone levels drop, you have to add all of those sets up. You can't count the 3 to 5 minutes as part of that. So does that make sense? And so the average set lasts about a minute, right? A minute and a half maybe. And
sure.
So for powerlifting and Olympic lifting, 10 sets in a workout is normal. It's just completely normal, and that's about roughly. I mean, it depends on the person and what they're doing, and whether they're working on high rep back squats or whether they're working on triples, singles and double, whatever. The average thing is you have the experience in the body of working hard for 40 minutes or so. In my opinion, it's after that point, no matter how you've made that 40 minutes of intense activity up, that's the time you should be thinking about leaving the gym. Roughly.
So it's interesting, because what that conjures up is the distinction between doing something because it's optimal or doing something because it reinforces your identity as a bodybuilder or a powerlifter, or
Sure.
being in the gym, being clear about your goal. And you said there's nothing wrong with wanting to go and show off your pecs and biceps if that's what you're into. But for me personally, I don't really like gyms. And make friends.
Sorry,
yeah. But I mean, I find gyms quite an unpleasant place to be in for a long time. And so yeah, as you said, I'd rather just be in and out. And you see it with powerlifters as well, where they'll adopt the persona of powerlifter and grow the beard and listen to heavy metal and go for a McDonald's after the competition and all these things which aren't really furthering their progress, but because it's all part of the identity, it's kind of spun into this tradition.
And no problem. That's the thing. No problem with that. I have so many close friends who are Olympic lifters and powerlifters, and some of them fit that mold perfectly. It's absolutely no problem at all. But in this conversation, what we're trying to, I guess the subtext of everything that we've spoken about is actually being clear about what it is that you're doing in the moment of doing it. In other words, being mindful about your training, just the same as one is trying to be mindful about everything else. Again, without being obsessive about it. My goal was simply to get my health back, and I managed that in that year. And at the time when I was training with Stan Pienko, which was the time when I was powerlifting, and I made the best gains ever that I've made in any 6-week period, we were doing a 2 to 2.5, occasionally 3-hour session on Sunday, a very leisurely pace, but absolutely everything done properly and perfectly. And the increases in my lifts, and I was a relatively mature athlete then, I would have been 28, I would say, 29, so not mature for a powerlifter, but relative. I've been lifting for many years at that point. We made phenomenal gains, and it was by not doing. Of course, the more mature an athlete is, the more rebound effect you can get by decreasing your load momentarily, even if the intensity and the actual weights that you're lifting are higher. It's all intensity versus volume. You can't actually do both. No one ever can.
For sure. And it's why I think doing 2 sets to failure, for example, and ruining the subsequent sets and tanking your performance is actually a worse thing to do, because then you're sacrificing total volume in favour of just a single set that's hard and just to feel like you've trained, rather than actually have a measurable increase in volume session to session.
But having said that, every now and again when you do feel like that, doing that is no problem at all. But instead of doing the 8 or 10 sets that you had in mind, you do the 2 or 3 sets at a much higher intensity, and you think, right, I'm getting stronger, I can feel that, and you stop there.
Oh, for sure. If it's done in the right point in the training cycle, definitely overreach and cut the volume. But I think as long as it's planned out over a wider period.
Yeah, I guess what we're really talking about here is the extent to which, and I've seen so many people do this, I mentioned this when we were talking once before, I had an Olympic lifting coach at one point who would literally remake my program for the day based on how I looked as I walked in through the heavy weights room door. And that's you have to have a real eye to see that kind of thing. And occasionally, I'd be walking and I'd feel like crap and actually have the best lift, of that month, or sometimes even 2 months. You just can't tell. But a good coach, if you have the luxury of having a good coach, you should really listen to what they say. And if they say, I know you're feeling great today, but my suggestion is back off, and let's see if we can hit those marks next week or 2 weeks' time, my advice strongly is take that advice.
You've got to be able to get your ego out of the way to take that advice, for sure. Yeah.
Anyway, so my suggestion is, I know we've got lots of things to talk about, I think we should go back to the questions, and I will attempt to answer the questions briefly. Although I know you and I both know this, there really aren't any simple answers to complex problems, but we will make a show of trying to do that.
Fine. So, the next question was from Connie, saying, I got injured because of imbalances in my body. I do physio exercises that target specific muscles and areas, in spite of the fact that I can engage said muscles while doing these exercises. Once I try to engage them in normal activities or during sport, they don't fire. Is there a more intelligent way of training these weak or injured areas than the physio approach?
Well, I don't want to cast aspersions on fellow practitioners, but I've worked side by side and parallel and separate to physiotherapists since I began my own clinic practice, and like all practitioners, there are really good ones and there are ones who are just what I would call journeymen. And I'm reminded of or journey women, I'm reminded of a saying that was popular in Japan when I was living there, which is, beware the artisan who claims 20 years of experience in his field, when in fact it's 1 year's experience repeated 20 times. So, my advice to Connie is, if those exercises are not working and are not transferring to your other activities, and you're still continuing to get injured, the root cause has in fact not been addressed or dealt with at all, probably not even identified. Let me give you an example. Let's say Connie's a sprinter. I don't know whether she's a sprinter or not. If you do not have loose enough hip flexors, you will be continually liable to pull your outer hamstrings, because the outer hamstrings are the only muscles that can pull the legs behind the body when you're trying to sprint. And if your hip flexors are tight, the reciprocal inhibition reflex will be switching the glute off at the very moment it's supposed to be extending the hip joint. You may well be able to do step-ups and all the other activities that activate the glutes in that part of the range of movement, but when you get to extension, if the hip flexors are tightening, I guarantee you, your brain will shut the glutes off. There's no way around that apart from loosening the hip flexors. I mean, you know this, I'm sure. Getting back to the first part of Connie's question, in my experience as a clinician, the most important imbalances to address in the human body, and this applies to flexibility, it applies to strength, it applies to coordination, it applies to left and right-handedness, left and right leggedness, is redressing any asymmetries that you find in that left-right axis sense. Front-back is different rules apply in that plane, but in the plane between the shoulder blades, the plane of the body as you look at the body, certain functions derive from the structure of the body as you look at it, front and back, and they should be symmetrical, assuming you've got the same length legs. And that's another thing, as you know, I have quite a significant leg length difference. That needs its own treatment. But the key rule here is any left-right differences you find in strength or range of movement must be redressed. And the way they're addressed is unilateral strength training for arms and legs. And of course, most of those unilateral exercises are also core exercises. So when one is doing things like one-arm push-ups or single leg squats or all the other things that one can do unilaterally, you are also always and inevitably strengthening the core as well. So again, doing the right exercise, there are so many things you don't need to think about. And on that note, I would say the right exercises are always the most difficult ones. So, getting back to Connie, supposing you have a left-right imbalance in shoulder flexibility or hip flexibility, you have one tighter hip flexor on one side or one tighter hamstring on one side, and as a side note, a looser or tighter hamstring is an effect, not a cause. We'll talk about that another time. These are just ways into reading how the body is using itself, really. You need to look at your feet and see whether you've got callousing on the inside of your feet versus the outside. If you do, your ankles pronate under load, and you carry more of the weight of your body on pronating ankles, and that will definitely lead to long-term damage of the medial side of the knee in time and can have its own effect on the hip joints. So, in short, the most important considerations are left-right hip flexor length and strength, left-right hamstring length and strength, left-right lateral flexion of the spine, and left-right rotation of the spine. They are the key functions to pay very close attention to. And if you cannot activate your glutes in the hip extension range of movement, you must do our hip flexor exercises, and please link to the free ones on YouTube. We don't have any inner secrets in our system, as you know. The hip flexor exercises on YouTube are still the best hip flexor exercises we know. And we work with elite people, dancers, gymnasts, all sorts of different people who do think they're already flexible. But you know from your own experience, once you put the body in that hip flexor stretch position, and we've got 3 or 4 grades of difficulty of that exercise, there is no escape. The hip flexors have to let go, and it's just so liberating. In fact, I'll just say one side comment on that is that most of the tension that people experience in their own spine and neck is actually parasitic tension, but it's necessary parasitic tension because the hip flexors are too tight. If you have an anteriorly tilted pelvis, it is absolutely necessary that the erector spinae muscles and the paravertebrals and all of your neck extensor muscles must be generating extra tension simply to hold you upright. And your body will do this absolutely automatically. The alternative is to go through life leaning forward, and people just don't do that. If you've got a lumbar extension, you will have parasitic tension. And we've just had so many people on the workshop do the hip flexor stretch, and we do it in the afternoons now, not the mornings, and they'll get up off the floor and they'll say, "Oh, that's amazing. That tension I have in my neck is gone."
Everything's straightened up.
Exactly.
Your hip flexor stretch, the partner version, is one of my favourite things, one of my top 3 stretches from you. The others being the pec minor partner stretch with a broomstick.
Yeah.
And
amazing.
The scalenes one.
Well, in fact, those two, if you think about it, are tied together, aren't they, in a functional sense? Look, take a step back. Human beings, bipedal mammals, always, when you're on your feet, you're always seeking balance. No such thing as standing still. Any guardsman any Buckingham Palace guards will tell you, no such thing. We're constantly moving. Anyone that's done handstand practice knows we're constantly adjusting and moving. That is the disadvantage of the bipedal stance versus a quadrupedal stance. But it also has phenomenal advantages too. It gives you agility and speed and capacities to do movement which other animals can't do, and so on and so forth.
So something I should mention as well to Connie is to check out Kit's book on back pain. If the issue you're talking about relates to back pain, there's a full DIY assessment and treatment, and it's very practical, and it goes over left-right imbalances, how to measure your leg length differences, and a flow chart for how to arrive at the correct stretches for you. There's also another book on general stretching which addresses the other joints as well.
I would like to know, in order to answer Connie's question more effectively, perhaps the next time we speak, we actually need to know what the nature of the injuries are, and well, if let's say, I'm extemporizing here, but if in fact it is outer hamstrings, which are such a common problem in athletes, then I would put my money on tight hip flexors for the reasons we went through. But if it's something else, if it's in order of frequency or likelihood of frequency, and of course whether this applies to Connie or not, as you know from your studies of statistics, we can't actually say, even though people love to say things like 50% of the population have a leg length difference. Statistics 101 tells you that actually tells you nothing about the next person who walks in your clinic door. They're either in that group of 50% or they're outside of that group of 50%. And the tendency, the movement, the mental movement from correlation to cause is just so common in science, and it's a fundamental error, as you know. Anyway, so we would need to know more about the specificities of her problem, and we can make some suggestions on what are the most likely causes, even if they turn out not to be the actual causes.
Cool. So I think that's a good starting point for Connie anyway. Now, on a similar note, this is a question from me, Kit, that there's a guy, he's a strength coach called Chris Duffin, and he has this idea that, and it works pretty well with his athletes, that sometimes what we consider to be a lack of mobility is actually a lack of stability. And the example that he uses is in a squat, where somebody might have the passive range of motion in their hip for, say, internal rotation and flexion, but when they go into a squat, they lose it. And his idea is that because this functional lack of mobility is actually not bracing the abs correctly and allowing the hips to not be under a state of threat, and so they can actually move through that range properly. I'm sure you're familiar with this idea. Is this anything that do you use any stability training in light of this with your own athletes?
The only stability training that we do, excuse me, is actually looking at how their knee tracks when they step up. So we don't even use a high block. I mean, we would normally, for someone who's a beginning strength trainer, because our hope, of course, and it's an unjustified hope, is that someone whose experience has actually sorted all this shit out, but they don't, of course. This is something we can return to. We ask someone to come up on the ball of the back foot, put the front foot on a step of, let's say, 12 inches of height or so on, and without using the back leg to push off, step up onto the block.
It's hard.
So what we do is it's much harder than people think. And what we're looking for is medial knee movement. Medial knee movement far and away is the most common effect in the body. And if that is happening in your body, you must apply another frog in my throat. This is the problem with talking first thing in the morning, right? Just hang on a tick. That's better. We know that the medial knee movement in the step-up action is caused, again, such a loaded term, but the function that happens is the adductor strength momentarily is stronger than the external rotation counter rotation, or it's not sufficiently cued, or the pattern is not sufficiently embedded in the body so the brain automatically engages the external rotators as you step up, and that's probably the most common explanation. And as a result, as the force of the glutes is applied to the thigh, the knee tracks medially. But here's the thing, it is such a simple thing to fix. You put the person in the block stepping up position in front of a mirror and you say, concentrate your awareness on your knee and do not let it move medially. There is no one that can't get that sensation right in half a dozen reps.
So I suppose the answer to a lot of these things is to actually build the awareness to find where you are not stable and distinguish then whether it's stability or mobility.
Yusef, when we teach strength training, we have a monkey gym stream, as you know, we're just not teaching it at the moment. The first thing we say in class 1 is, we're going to teach you about awareness. And the guys who are interested in building up their biceps will say, what the fuck, I'm not interested in awareness, I just want the guns. We say, okay, if that's what you want, the closer connection you have to the sensation of how to use your biceps rather than your lats, say in a pull-up, or how to maximize the engagement of biceps brachii over brachialis and brachioradialis, the stronger and the quicker you can strengthen the biceps.
But listen to any high-level bodybuilder, that's all they talk about.
Look, my friend Tom Platz, he said, in the film that I made about, remember the Arnold Schwarzenegger film I directed, The Comeback? He said, your mind is in the muscle. Now, Tom was an absolute expert at doing this. If you watch him do leg extensions, and there's some fabulous footage in that film of his 28-inch quads extending this relatively minor weight. They were amazing to see. They're almost a life force of their own. Anyway, getting back to the problem tracking, or the problem of stability versus the coach that you refer to, his perception is accurate. You simply cannot, if your body feels unstable, it's almost impossible to activate those muscles voluntarily because the body's in protective mode, and you have to have the willpower of, a Martin Birkins to actually overpower that reflexive, deeply hardwired action. So what you do, and this is a very fundamental thing that a lot of coaches actually don't get right, in my opinion. When someone let's say someone has a strength capacity of X, if you're trying to teach them a new motor pattern, which is effectively what we're talking about, and now the specifics of the movement are not important. This applies to all new motor patterns. you have to use a resistance that's much, much, much smaller than X, so the person can feel what's happening in their body. So getting back to the, we teach awareness thing, and this will apply, will connect directly to what I've just said. In my first presentation to our beginning weight training students, I'll say, look, let me just show you, and I'll jump up on the chin-up bar, and I'll say, look, watch this. This is a chin-up that's done completely using only arm muscles, and I'll pull my chin to the bar, close grip, and it's obvious that the muscles in my back are almost completely relaxed. And then I'll say, okay, now watch this. By organising the muscles in a particular way, leaning back and thinking about pulling my elbows to my waist instead of thinking about pulling my chin to my hands, watch this. All of a sudden, the lats pop out, and now it's a back training exercise. And so I say to the guys who just want the big biceps, so unless you have the capacity to voluntarily contract muscle X versus muscle Y, I said, you're just flying blind. And this is how, you know, so many bodybuilders who don't have good back muscles but have fabulous arms, when you watch them pulling, whether it's a seated row or whether it's a standing version of the seated row, they're pulling with their arms and not with their back muscles. And that has to be cued. In some people, that absolutely has to be cued.
So on the note of building awareness then, we have a question from James saying, are there any enhancements that you would recommend to build awareness? And he's mentioned using psychedelics or MDMA, which I think is a bit of a sledgehammer approach, but is there anything else along that spectrum that you would advise?
Well, no, there's no chemistry I can recommend. Although I have to say to a friend of mine who has done an immense amount of practical experimentation in this area, claims that MDMA is the secret to acquiring one's potential flexibility rapidly. But I have not experimented with this myself, and the main reason is very simply that I don't know of any reliable MDMA supplier. How are you possibly going to dose yourself up on stuff where you don't actually know what's in what you're putting in your mouth? I personally will not do that. Just the same as I don't eat processed food. I'm not a fanatic about it, but the centre aisles of the supermarket I stay out of. I only eat from the aisles on the outside.
It's funny, actually. It's the same reason why I don't take drugs or steroids, is more of a quality control issue than a moral issue per se with the drugs.
Absolutely. Yeah, so in terms of developing awareness, speaking to James now, there is no trick to developing awareness. Let me just illustrate from the many meditation workshops that I've taught. This is a typical person reporting his or her experiences following a meditation session. But first I'll give you a thought experiment. You're sitting in front of a hall, you're watching a hall of 50, 60, 70 people. It's a typical kind of retreat number. They're all sitting there. They've got their hands in the sort of recommended meditation position. Their eyes are half closed in the recommended, relaxed gaze position. And then this is what happens. They'll sit there, and the next thing you know, the head bobs like this. And then a few more seconds goes by, 10, 15, 20, head bobs like this. And then if you ask, that goes on for 40 minutes. And then if you debrief that person following the session, tell me about your sitting. Fantastic, they'll say. It was absolutely fantastic. What was actually happening is they were falling asleep, and the stretch reflex was waking them up repeatedly throughout the 40 minutes. They actually spent most of the time asleep. And you have to take this on faith. If you're not an experienced meditator, it is absolutely possible to fall asleep and dream that you're meditating and maintain your posture. I promise you this is possible. So, the meditators, in contrast, who feel that they're not meditating well, they'll report things like, oh, look, I was sitting there, but I was just so distracted. I was trying to bring my awareness to the breath, and then I noticed straight away that I started thinking about Aunt Merle, and I said, no, I'm just going to gently corral my awareness and bring it back to my breathing. I took 2 breaths, and then my attention went straight back to Aunt Merle. And at the end of the meditation and process, when they're reporting, they'll say, and so I feel I'm a complete failure. And Patrick and I were saying, no, that's meditating. To notice that you're distracted is absolutely the first fundamental part, because the first group of people who felt they were meditating really well, they did not even notice they were falling asleep. Noticing is actually what meditating is about. Awareness is nothing more than directing your attention to place A or place B or place C, and noting when the attention is drawn away by the thought stream, and it's always the thought stream, or it can be some painful part of the body, like a knee that doesn't want to sit in that position for any longer.
This is the metacognizance, and I'm sure anyone who's sat an exam and felt like it went terribly, and then everyone else like, oh, that was fine, I was a piece of piss. It's always the ones who thought it was easy that did worse, because they don't know what they didn't know, and so
yes.
Yeah.
That's gold there, my friend. They did not know what they don't know. And so, coming back to James, you cannot be aware of what you don't know that you're aware of. It's the same. It is exactly the same. Awareness is nothing more than paying attention to what's happening now and making sure that the attention is not sliding off into a daydream. And that's why the Buddhas say life is a dream within a dream. Because for most people, as I said this the other time that we were talking, and maybe this will make a bit more sense when I put it this way, for the majority of people we know, reality is the story that's going on between their ears. It is not what's actually happening, but if your attention is completely caught up in the space between your ears, you have no alternative perspective. There is only the thought stream. And when that's running away with you, you will defend that very strongly, aggressively. That's normal human life, unfortunately. So anyway, to James, I do not recommend MDMA or LSD or ayahuasca or any other wonderful substances, unless you happen to come across a shaman who's actually practiced in the use of these things, and you can be certain that the source that you're playing with is sound.
So what about more readily available stuff? So caffeine, alcohol, morning versus evening, after a hot bath, for example.
Caffeine is wonderful. No one, in my view, should go into the gym without having a decent, well, actually, long black, you probably know this from your chemistry studies, but long black coffees have much more caffeine in them than short black coffees. Short black coffees, the actual duration that the water is in contact with the coffee grounds for is much shorter, normally, depending on which way you make your long blacks. I mean, today they pull a short black and then add water to it. My strong recommendation is to just pull that water all the way through, so that because the caffeine is actually relatively slower dissolving than many of the other caffeinols and caffeinoids. You probably read this. And so if you want a really strong cup of coffee, you actually need to brew it for a reasonable length of time.
Okay, so I'm personally a bit of a coffee philistine. I used to abuse caffeine when I worked in an office and managed to engineer seasonal affective disorder in myself. Apparently it shuts off the vitamin D receptor. And
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
So and I was working in Edinburgh at the time, and you'd leave for work at 7 a.m, and it was dark, and you'd come home and it was still dark, and there was no windows in the office. And I realised that because I was nailing the caffeine and basically having no external vitamin D, I stopped the caffeine, hammered, superdosed vitamin D for a few days, and very quickly all of the mood and sleep quality and sex drive and all the rest of it came back up again. So, thought that was interesting. So now I'm quite
extremely interesting. I mean, vitamin D. We should mention this, but we pronounce that word vitamin. You guys pronounce the word vitamin. That does mean the same thing. Let me use your terminology. Vitamin D is responsible. It seems to be a sufficient level of vitamin D seems to be necessary as a precursor to the manufacture of over 200 enzymes in the liver, I think. It is phenomenally important, way more important, I think, than people thought previously. The problem with the whole vitamin idea is that, as you know, the requirement for something to be judged or described as a vitamin is very, very restrictive. There are many, many more phytonutrients, that are important, not just the 53, whatever it is, vitamins. And the description, or the test descriptor is this: the removal of a vitamin has to cause a disease, and the re-addition of a vitamin to that person's diet has to be shown to cure the disease. That's an incredibly restrictive set of constraints, don't you think?
Sure.
And so there are over 10,000 phytonutrients, and we're absolutely certain that many, many more of these are useful at a deep and powerful way, but they do not yet satisfy the vitamin constraints. That's the roughest, crudest, broadest brush approach, it seems to me.
I'm sure once the constraints are widened, or as people kind of heuristically get to the point where they realise the importance of these things, I'm already seeing a few consultants in hospital just up here that now put anybody on vitamin D when they come in, just because the deficiencies are so rife and there's not really much of a side effect from high doses. So that just becomes their standard.
Look, you can tell straight away whether someone's likely to be vitamin D deficient. Are they as white as a sheet or not? Because the best way to get vitamin D, and in exactly the amount that you need, is to expose your body to sunlight for 20 or 30 minutes a day.
So actually, there's a talk, I know we're going on a tangent again, but there was a talk from a dermatologist and GP talking about the difference in heart disease from Scotland and Australia. And he was saying that the Australians like to think that it's because of their finer moral standing, although actually lifestyles are relatively comparable between Scottish and Australian people. And he realised that a lot of it was because of sunlight exposure, and it's not just vitamin D mediated, but something to do with nitric oxide and how it has a vasodilating capacity, and saying that this could explain some of the differences in heart disease. And he said because heart disease is such a common disease, it outweighs the risk of melanoma, for example, which, although is a very aggressive cancer, it's much less common relative to heart disease.
I agree completely. It's not just, we're getting back to our old sort of John Grimmack era bodybuilding thing. Those guys cultivated a decent tan, and they would tell you, when I'm tanned, I feel better. Now that's such a loose, imprecise, how do you measure that sort of thing? I mean, our evidence-based medicine would have a lot of trouble with the concept of feeling well. I mean, and as you know, it does. That's one of its major problems. But those guys and girls, they were convinced that a tan actually helped them in that way. And I'm not talking about the kind of, super dark tan that the modern bodybuilders do now. These guys were just talking about getting a light tan. They'd exercise out of doors, and it all just happened by itself. And on that note, Olivia and I have been exercising while we've been here in London. We go to Finsbury Park, and there's an outdoor centre there. Most of the users of that outdoor centre are British Africans. Most, I think, are from Jamaica, from their accents. And there's a couple of Afro-Americans there as well. The friendliest, loveliest group of people on the planet. It's just so interesting to me that divide. They welcomed us into their group straight away. And so we're doing our chin-ups and our front lever preps and German hangs and what else? Multiple chin-ups and handstand push-ups and all that kind of things. And that's what they're all doing too. And guess what? Vitamin D. We're having a good time, meeting lovely people, having a strong workout. We then go for a long walk around the park, either before or after that, and that's it. We're done for the day.
Sounds lovely.
It's fantastic. So just on that note, for people who are interested in bodyweight strength training, my own personal division into the kind of work that I'll do is I'll do vertical pushing and pulling, which are variations on supported handstands, various handstand activities, negative handstand push-ups, positive handstand push-ups using wall support, so that's all the pushing stuff, and only that one plane, and I intersperse that and complement that with all the vertical pulling exercises. Right, so chin-ups, pull-ups, front lever prep, all the things that are the heavy-duty pulling exercises, but nothing horizontal. Then I'll let a good day go by and I'll do something else. I might jump up and down on logs or something, who knows, whatever it is that I feel like. And the second workout for the upper body in that week will be horizontal pushing and pulling. Now you can do all of that perfectly at a park. They've all got places where you can do push-ups of innumerable kinds. They've all got places where you can do horizontal pull-ups of innumerable kinds. And for me, the vertical and the horizontal, that does the whole of the shoulder joint. And you don't need to think about anything. It's so much fun. And then there's a whole stretching thing which happens in between doing all of those things. So it's a concentrated workout. It just feels marvellous to do. Both of us really love it. And in fact, we get more, even though the whole bottom floor of our house is a gym at home when we're back in Australia, we get more physical work in our bodies when we were away, just by finding the right park to play in. It's fantastic.
That is great. Well, I'm glad you're making the most out of the London trip.
And the weather here has been sensational. It's a bit cooler today, but the weather so far has just been astounding. Next question, please.
Sure. I'm gutted I couldn't come down and do this interview in person, but hopefully next time.
The next time we will. What we're doing, and I should mention this, we will only be coming. Not quite sure. We will be coming to London next year, but we will be coming to London. We think every second year from now on. We're going to make an announcement about the local people at the teachers that we have trained here. But I don't want to preempt that, so we'll make that later. And we're going to be going to London once every 2 years, and we think Singapore every second year as well, because they're our two hubs. But when we do come to London, hopefully next time we'll because our cat passed, our mascot Sue Chi passed just before we came out.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear.
She died literally in our arms. So it was really, really a beautiful and powerful moment for both of us. The fiction of the Western culture is that somehow we're all supermen who don't have an end date. Everything that lives dies. That's our fate. There's no such thing as anything that lasts forever. And the whole point of the Buddhist training that I spoke about on other occasions is to be clear, utterly clear about the things which are permanent, of which there are very few, and the vast majority of things which are impermanent, and to see that clearly. And of course, if something's impermanent, it's going to change and die. No problem. So when you start to wake up and see things more clearly, it simply makes the time that you have with, say, I don't say a person like Suu Kyi, but she was really very much like a personality like Suu Kyi, with a very distinct personality. And in fact, we were very lucky. We had a couple of weeks with her after she had come back from being in a veterinary hospital, where we were very clear that her life forces were diminishing, and we enjoyed her during those 2 weeks immensely, intensely and deeply. It was so beautiful and lovely. And that's all.
That's good. We have, on the note of impermanence, we have a few questions on that note, which we'll get to soon on someone who's been through a 10-day Vipassana retreat and had some questions for you on the back of that. Sure. But so the next question was Stu Mcgill. I don't know if you're aware of his work. Yeah. On the surface, his approach seems to contradict your approach with back pain, in that he's all about learning to generate stiffness of the spine, relearning or reacquiring the activation patterns in the spinal stabilizers, and creating the kind of the guy wires, the counter forces on either sides of the spine, as well as avoiding flexion-based stretches or flexion movement, not necessarily flexion moment, and delamination of saying that delamination of the spine and the life cycles of the vertebra flexing and extending is what predisposes us to injury. Now, one thing that he did say is that doing a combination of, say, yoga and powerlifting creates the perfect storm, in that the powerlifting you're laying down collagen and stiffening the spine, and then with yoga, repeated flexion extension, you're then delaminating it and allowing a disc to extrude more easily. And he also talks about kind of this correlation between flexibility and back pain. I don't know how much of Stu Mcgill's work you've read and what your thoughts are on his general approach relative to your own.
Well, I think Stuart has a deep theoretical understanding of these things, but in practice many of the things that he claims will happen do not happen. That's all I want to say on that. Delamination, it's like the yoga. Some schools of yoga have this belief that we're born with a certain number of breaths in the body, and so the reason they do breath extension work is basically to extend their life. Look, they're all ideas. They're concepts. The direct experience in the body, and I have read a great deal of Stuart's material. There is nothing in his material that I would describe as exemplifying that sense that has recently started to be popularly called interoception, which is the sense of what's actually happening in your body clearly. The clear sense of what is actually happening in my body as I do exercise or movement X or Y or something else. Our work is about refining that sense to the maximum possible. And when I do an exercise that he regards as something that potentially delaminates the spine, whatever that means, that is not what's happening in my body. When I do a powerlifting exercise, and I do, my go-to weight training exercise is the Romanian deadlift. Now the Romanian deadlift, in my opinion, is superior to the standard deadlift because it takes the spine from horizontal to, say, 45 degrees or a bit more above that, and so the strengthening, stiffening, laying down of collagen, which is not the way that Stuart explains these things, it's so extreme. Nothing in this life, in my experience, is ever this or that. In my opinion, the combination of the right kind of yoga, and we have to say the right kind of yoga because our work is not yoga, I would say the combination of our work, stretch therapy, which, unlike any other form of training, strengthens the muscles in the maximally elongated state. In other words, the normal sinusoidal force curve that, say, a bicep generates, and I demonstrated this in a workshop only a few days ago. I had a guy, I asked this guy, who's reasonably strong, to hold his arm out and keep it as stiff as he could, and I just showed how easy it was to bend his arm. I then held my own arm out, and I held it stiff, and no matter what he did, I could bend my arm against his resistance if I wanted to, or hold it stiff against his resistance. And the reason is, and he's a strong man, and I'm not Superman, and I'm not doing much strength training at all at the moment, but the difference is this: when you do your stretching and you use contractions at the end of the range of movement, and for men we use maximum contractions eventually once the body is conditioned enough to take that force. When you do that, instead of the force curve being sinusoidal, it's flat. I can generate almost full strength at the end of the range of movement in my hamstrings, in my quadriceps, in my biceps and my triceps. No strength training does that.
That is cool.
The only strength training exercise that does that is the standing calf raise, and that's because only the standing calf raise loads up the body maximally in the stretched position. All other weight training exercises are some alteration to that suggestion. But if you combine your strength training, or your stretching training with the right degree of strength training, I would say, rather than being the perfect storm that Stu Mcgill refers to, it is in fact the perfect solution to the problem of how to be human and how to survive with maximum function to the end of your life.
Interesting. And the best gains are made with full range of motion based on the data as well. And so, Kit, you've kind of answered the next question, which is Matthew saying, how would you overcome hyperextension in the knees or generally hypermobile joints?
Now that is an extremely interesting question. Firstly, we had a guy on the workshop, the same workshop, who described his own body as hypermobile, and I tested his leg extension off the floor, and I tested his elbow extension. He had no hypermobility at all. He'd just been misdiagnosed. In fact, he was very stiff all over. But some practitioner at some point had looked at his joints and said, you're hypermobile, and so he did not do any of the training which we would regard as being essential training as a result of that. You have to be terribly careful of what we were talking about recently, the nocebo effect, which is the effect, the disempowering effect of having someone tell you that you've got X or Y or something else, and you should be careful because of PQ and R. Most of it is nonsense. If you're paying attention to what's happening in your body, all of these things are merely your own set of personal attributes which need tweaking. Your training will need tweaking in a certain way to take account of those. Look, for example, let's say you're dealing with two things. One is you can't do handstands unless your elbow joints hyperextend. You cannot do them. You have to have a desirable amount of hyperextension in the elbow joint to do a good handstand, just as you need a certain amount of hyperextension in the knee joint to be able to stand relaxed. You have to. So, if we work with someone who is genuinely hypomobile in the knee joint, for example, and we teach them stretching, what we do, let's say we're talking about the triangle pose, everyone knows what that looks like. We show them the extension of the knee joint in the mirror and say, that is too much hyperextension. So flex your knee until the knee joint looks straight. And here's the next thing, tense every muscle around that joint and hold that knee in that position. Now do the bend. Same with handstands. if you can't hyperextend your elbows, we're going to have to stretch brachialis first, and then once you're up in some loaded position, whether it be a plank or whatever, then before you load that joint, tense everything. Now when I'm in a handstand position or a plank position, we have that exercise. I don't know whether you've seen me do this or not, but we have someone's foot against the hand that's on the ground. Let's say we're talking about the plank position. They then load up the elbow joint, as in they're trying to flex the elbow joint, and you are doing everything you can with whatever you've got to keep that elbow joint straight.
Okay, I've not seen that one.
Oh, it's a fundamental gymnastic strength training exercise. They all do it, and I tell you, you develop the unbendable arm. You actually have control over your arm, and look, next time we meet, you can try to bend my arm in that position. I've put it on your shoulder. You can hang off it. And I don't have big muscles, but I do have that control of the range of movement. So effective strength is a matter of neural innovation, and that itself is hugely dependent on your capacity to feel what's happening in the body as you apply your force.
So I suppose the answer is be clear on the diagnosis that you have got hypermobility. I actually know Matt personally, and he may have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, so a connective tissue disorder, and he's had repeated subluxations of his shoulder and ACL reconstruction and so on.
Just hang on a tick. You dropped out at that critical point. You said you know this patient and...
Oh, so there's a chance that he has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a connective tissue disorder, and multiple shoulder subluxations and knee. He's had ACL reconstruction.
Okay, the solution for that young man is careful weight training and no stretching.
At the end, and the strengthening at the end of the range of motion, as you described.
Because we know this from our other reading, any strength training in the absence of flexibility training tends to tighten up all the ligaments of the joint, providing it doesn't damage them first. And anyone with that connective tissue disorder has to be super careful with strength training and stretching training. But, and this is the important part, that does not mean they should not do these things.
Sure. It's just about striking the balance between, I suppose.
Exactly. And we say all the time, the right balance in stretching, just pretend you're using your, I want to sound polite here, so I'll say gonads as steering and brakes on a razor blade. That's what I mean by playing the razor's edge. On the one side, you have insufficient stress, so nothing will change, and on the other side, you're hurting yourself. That is the razor's edge we need to play in our strength training and our stretching training. Much, much more refined than what people talk about. And I'll include Stu Mcgill in this as well.
I see. So outside of Matt, I suppose the majority of our listeners are much too far on the strength end of the spectrum. And the good thing is that as we learned from you on the last podcast, that stretching doesn't negatively impact strength or hypertrophy, and if anything, it's a stimulus for hypertrophy in and of itself. So there's no real reason to not do it.
More than that. Let me interrupt you. The right amount of flexibility. Let me take a step back. I don't believe that anyone should start strength training before they've had their fundamental biomechanics looked at by someone who knows what they're talking about. For example, what is the point of trying to do a handstand if you can't actually get your arms in a sufficient range of flexion to be able to support your body's weight in good alignment? Practicing the handstand will not give you that range of movement. I mean, God, I know that myself, because it took Olivia years to convince me that my training partner and I were absolutely barking up the wrong tree. It's a funny story, so let me tell you the story. We'd worked out Dave. There's Dave, my apprentice, you know him, physical alchemist.
Sure.
Dave. He and I, one day when Olivia came up the stairs to our gym, Dave and I were just high-fiving each other. We just made what was for us at that stage in our gymnastic strength training. We'd done the first 2 by 2.5 minute wall supports. This is in the very beginning part of our training, but it took us a long time to get the 2.5 minutes where we were actively pressing the floor away, working hard. And Olivia just looked at me and rolled her eyes, and she just flipped herself up into a handstand against the wall, and over the next 7 minutes told us where we were going wrong. She just stayed in a perfect handstand position with no effort whatsoever. Now, Dave and I, we were fried by this point because we'd had 5 minutes in total time, and the reason is we were fighting our own structure.
I think I'm very much like you and Dave. I've got a very delty banana handstand, which...
Exactly. And so that needs to be corrected first, because actually you're sending the wrong signals proprioceptively to the handstand alignment problem. You have to be able to put yourself in the position first, and the banana handstand will not give you that alignment. It will not, I promise you, it will not give you that alignment. You have to get the body into exactly the right alignment, and now, well, this is what I was doing 2 days ago. I flipped myself up into a wall handstand, got the right alignment, asked Liz to check it for me, she said it was fine, and then I took my weight on one arm, and shifted the whole body across, held that for 10 or 15 seconds, then shifted back to the first arm, held that, repeated that twice. That was the handstand workout. So full body's weight supported on one arm. But unless you have the alignment, I could be built like Arnold Schwarzenegger, I'd never be able to support the weight on my arms. That's the point. The alignment, she made this point, and it is so critically important, and I'm just sorry I was so slow and I didn't see it. Strength comes from alignment as well as from muscles in certain positions. Now, in the full squat position, for example, here's a perfect example. If you can't keep your lumbar spine extended in a full squat, just slightly extended, you know, that really strong, tight position everyone wants, but many people can't get because their ankles aren't loose enough, or their calf muscles are too tight and the knee joints won't close enough, and all the other things that can go on. In my way of looking at these things, you're much better served doing some remedial work on your fundamental biomechanics first, or just doing some general physical preparation the way the Russians used to talk about it, and include your stretching in that to make sure that everything's working properly. I've got a decent lunge, I've got a decent body weight full squat with a straight back, I can hang from one arm, so in meaning I've got enough grip strength, I've got perfect shoulder alignment when you hang by one arm, everything, all of those problems will sort themselves out anyway, as you know. We've got some one arm hanging videos on YouTube, I think, and I worked up to 5 minutes. My training partner and I, Craig, we worked so 10 by 30 seconds on each arm, 5 minutes in total. And that's a lot of work. But
it is.
No shoulder problems. Just some basic things like that. And also the one more thing that I think is basic but so super important, those body weight exercises that gymnasts all start with, the planks, side planks, reverse planks, gymnastics plank, and then the one arm version of all of those things, they give you shoulder protraction, they give you activation of serratus anterior. The reverse plank is the best and most wonderful active stretch of pec minor, and so on and on and on. All those old-fashioned things are gold.
It's funny because those things are so tedious to do, and so people skip over them, but then you end up paying the price later because, so as you're saying, position comes first. And you're right, like 2.5 minutes in a handstand, even chest to wall, for me, I'd be fried. And it almost feels like, because I'd lack some of the shoulder flexion, it's almost as if you're holding a dumbbell in like a front raise position for that long with your body weight.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah. Now you dropped out there for me, so you might want to repeat that. It's just the same as holding out a dumbbell in a front raise position, I think.
In a front raise position, exactly. So
there's a better example, and this one also, it's so funny because Olivia exposed one of my weaknesses. That's her job, I think, in my life, is to expose my weaknesses. We're doing that exercise, a very, very good exercise, where you lie face down, you hold your arms out like this face down, and you try and lift your arms off the ground with a small weight in your arms. Have you ever tried to do that?
Yeah, can't even break the floor.
Yeah, so here's this. I'm on the ground in the gym, and I said, Liv, check this out. And I said, I was saying, see, I've got this weight off the ground. I think I had it was a light steel bar. So it would have been not an Olympic lifting bar because they're 20 kilos. It would have been a light steel bar, 1-inch bar that we used for something else, probably weighed 15 pounds or something like that. You know how I was getting it off the ground?
Lumbar extension. Oh, okay.
I mean, it was so funny. And she just cracked up and said, no, mate, you're not actually lifting the weight off the ground with your shoulders. You got it? And so anyway, so then I tried to lift my... I couldn't even separate the bar from the floor if I was doing it properly. So in our system, form is the first and the most important rule. And rule 2 is, see rule 1. Form is everything.
For sure. It's, I mean, that exercise particularly, if anyone hasn't tried it and you're thinking, oh, that doesn't sound too hard, go and lie down now with a broomstick or even like a bit of paper and try and do it. Guarantee.
But you have to do it with a flat spine, a tucked tail. So the requirement of the exercise to pass it is you have to be lying face down, you have to tuck your tail so your whole tummy and pubic bone is pressed hard on the floor. You then have to reach the arms off the body in the plane of the floor and then try and lift them off the ground.
I see.
It's a brutal exercise. And of course, I mean, the reason why the gymnasts do it is once you can do it, you've got the right handstand line. And then when you get up against the wall, you won't be holding yourself up with massive tricep and trap activity. You'll actually just be aligned.
That would be nice.
It's a completely different feeling. Well, it'll happen. Okay, next question.
Next question is from Al, a fellow Australian. He says, first of all, let Kit know that I'm seeing results with my foot stretching routine for plantar fasciitis from your YouTube channel. 6 mornings a week, I can now fit a thick part of my fingers in between my toes, and it's only half excruciating now, although unfortunately the plantar fasciitis is being slow to clear up. Anyway.
Okay, just stop.
Sure.
Plantar fasciitis, what he needs to do, this is to forestall what might come next. And what's his name? Al? is the questioner's name Al? Okay, you're dropping out occasionally. In fact, it could even be our end, I'm not sure. Our connection is not perfect. Okay, Al, brace yourself, because what you need to do, my friend, is you need to find a patch of gravel near your house, and you need to walk down to that patch of gravel. You need to contemplate the gravel with full awareness, and you need to take your shoes off and carefully step onto the gravel and just let your whole body relax. Plantar fasciitis, the main cause of it, we are certain this is true. It's identical in mechanism to tinnitus, or tinnitus I think you call it. Basically, the reason why the plantar fascia is signaling pain is because there is a proprioceptive input that it's not getting, and the neural system is amplifying the feedback from the soles of the feet, and it's experienced as pain rather than sensation. We had a girl at one of our senior teachers, who won't mind me mentioning her name, Marin Brown, very good teacher of stretch therapy and was an ex-gymnast and all the rest of that. But she had plantar fasciitis so badly at one point in her teaching career, teaching within our system, that she had to come to class wearing these thick, soft running shoes so that she could just stand on the floor. And I gave her the same advice, and I remember the look on her face when I said she had to go out to that patch of gravel that I knew was in front of her house.
You're an evil person, yeah.
And she just looked horrified, and she said, I can't do that. And I said, well, maybe you have to unweight the body a little bit, maybe you have to organise a clothesline or something above so that you can take some of the weight off the soles of your feet. But I said, until you can actually stand on gravel and eventually walk around on gravel, even if it's only for a moment or two, the plantar fasciitis will not go away by itself. And she has absolutely zero plantar fasciitis now. It took her about 2 years. Plantar fasciitis is re-establishing the correct significance of the feedback that's coming from the proprioceptors. In other words, the gain is turned up too high in anyone who has plantar fasciitis. And so the calf muscle stretches will help because they pull on the plantar fascia. The toe separating things will help as well. But the body... one of the reasons why plantar fasciitis is so common today, and it just didn't exist 100 years ago, is that no one walks in bare feet anymore, or very few people do. And also we don't actually walk very much. Abraham Lincoln, that I was talking about before, no farmers and people of that era would think anything of walking 20 miles. They just would not. They'll just say, we're going to be here tomorrow at such and such a time. 20 miles. Now, I don't know anyone who's not a bushwalker who'd actually think about being able to walk 20 miles. That's how weak and feeble the human body is today, and we just have to accept that as reality. And one of the downsides of this weakness is an over-amplification of many of the signals that are coming from the body, which are designed. I mean, the proprioceptive mechanism in the feet is absolutely fundamental to balance and coordination, and also relearning motor patterns. You might recall in the workshops we say any time you can have a palm in contact with the floor, or the sole of your feet in contact with the floor, or against a wall, or something that tells the brain what's happening in these parts of the body, your progress is impeded immensely. And the proprioceptors as sense organs, as you know, are most numerous in the soles of the feet and next most numerous in the palms of the hand. No accident. They're the two parts of the body that we exert force on the world via. And so the brain has to know. Here's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. You've had the experience of reaching down to pick a glass of water off the table and suddenly finding it flying off the table because it's actually plastic, not glass.
Yep.
And this is how quickly this all happens. We calculate precisely the amount of force that we think we need on the basis of past proprioceptive experiences, and as soon as we touch that glass and start to pick it up, the calculation of how much force is needed is remade in the instant, and we suddenly find, oh, that's plastic, not glass, and you don't spill the water.
And it makes a lot of sense
what
you said about the gain being turned up. You know, you described running trainers as kind of wearing a cast on your foot at the workshop, and by doing so, you're messing with the natural signals that are coming through. So, you're still there?
So you dropped out there again. You dropped out again. By wearing feet, we're missing out on
the natural signals that we would normally be picking up on. So, what Al says...
One more very important thing with running shoes. Running shoes allow a heel strike. The biomechanics of running in running shoes is completely different to the biomechanics of running in bare feet. And look, regardless of whether or not you endorse barefoot running, I do personally, but you have to acknowledge the reality of this next statement, and that is the human body evolved for a minimum of 100 and perhaps up to 300,000 years without the benefit of any shoes whatsoever. So I think we can say prima facie that good biomechanics is actually the mechanics the body has to use when running in bare feet. Would you agree with that?
That makes sense, yeah.
Well, everyone who runs in bare feet will either land with their foot flat on the ground softly, or they'll be a 4-foot striker. Absolutely no one in the natural environment can be a heel striker. It just hurts too much. And so the advice that I give people, if you want to learn how to run properly, run without making any noise whatsoever, and do a small amount of barefoot running and walking first to see what movement the body actually needs to be able to do that without hurting itself. And if you see that, you'll see the full flowering of the pose method, or whatever that other method is called about natural running. That's it. That's exactly all it is. Nothing more than that. It's an elaborate, expensive process of relearning, but if you want to learn it yourself quickly, take off your shoes and just walk and jog lightly without making any noise as far as you can in bare feet, and stop after you can't go any further. Do that.
So there's some very actionable tips for plantar fasciitis. So Al's question actually was that this has been echoed by a few other readers as well. I had an experience of deep emotional blocks releasing after a 10-day Vipassana retreat a few years back. And for a very rational materialist, it changed the way that I see the mind-body-spirit connection. What is the best way that you see to release emotional blocks manifesting in the body? And as I say, many other people echoed this.
You dropped out during that question. If you wouldn't mind repeating the question, I'd be very
So he said, what is the best way to release emotional blocks manifesting in the body? And this was echoed by several others.
The answer is extremely simple. The practice requires commitment and awareness and effort. Releasing emotional blocks. I'll take a step back. Wilhelm Reich, who on many accounts, including my own, is Freud's most brilliant student. Wilhelm Reich, who wrote the book The Function of the Orgasm and a whole bunch of other things besides. There were Freud had 4 main, most famous students. Wilhelm Reich famously said, neurosis is identical to muscular tension. That you can't get more direct than that. Everything that his claim was, and he echoes John Locke, the Scottish philosopher, in this as well. He said, when the child comes into the world, it really is effectively a tabula rasa. It's a clean slate, or empty slate actually. Meaning, when you look at a baby, you can see this straight away. They're completely open. They have no filters between themselves and the world. They look at you, they gaze at you. There's no reaction, negative in them. No, They're simply experiencing whatever it is that they're experiencing in that moment. But Wilhelm went on to say, every insult and injury is experienced as muscular tension / trauma in that child's body. And so, when a child is spoken to harshly, or when it hurts itself, or when someone abuses it, or whatever the past history of each of these people is, that is recorded in the body, not in the mind. This is where the fundamental neurophysiology is actually not accurate. So an emotional block is simply some part of your body or your internal organs where you cannot release or relax tension. In other words, an experience is stored as a pattern of held tension because you can't let it go. Here's the Gedanken, the thought experiment. You're lying face down on a massage table. The massage therapist is running their hands up and down your spine, and it feels absolutely luxurious and gorgeous, right? It feels good. Everyone's had that experience. But then they move a quarter of an inch one way or another, and the next thing you know, you feel pain. The places are just those places you can't voluntarily relax. So pressure is experienced as pleasure when you can let the tension go, and that's what the soft parts of our body feel like. The hard parts of our body where we can't let that tension go, that's the blockage. Now I'm skating over some chasms here, but that's the function. So and you've heard me talk about this on the workshop, so I won't repeat these stories now, but except to say that the idea of a person or the recollection of a trauma itself recreates that exact same experience in the body. Until that is processed consciously, until you have whatever technique you need to use, the capacity to let that part of the body go that you can't normally let go, the trauma will be re-experienced each time. And so a 10-day Vipassana retreat, I would say, and this is slightly different to what I'm talking about now, and I'm going to answer the question directly in a moment, but I would say whatever emotional catharsis or whatever emotional experiences, or emotional experience is probably the best word to use, you have on a meditation retreat, just experience them as fully as you can and let them pass through the body, because they are the perfect example of impermanence, and they will never last. Even if you sit there for half an hour feeling the deepest grief you've ever felt, it will pass. There's nothing more certain than that. It will pass. So what most people do is that any experience that they have is so unpleasant momentarily, they have to withdraw from the experience because they can't let it pass by itself. If you dive in and go in the opposite direction, and that's always the way to go, the opposite direction, go into it, not away from it, it will pass. And the realization that occurs, and this is why it's called insight meditation, the realization will arise, it's not real. It's just a feeling. So to answer the question in a different way, what can we do about emotional blocks how can we, I don't like to use the word deal with them, how can we uncover and transform them? We have to find all the tight parts in our body and work on them in the way that we recommend. And hip flexors are unquestionably the most important place for the storage of these memories or these traumas, and that's simply because even if you're a flexible person, the last part of your body that you will have ever stretched is psoas. Now psoas, if you'll recall from your own anatomical studies, is always drawn as a kind of a flat strap-like muscle. It's nothing like that in real life. If you want to see what psoas looks like accurately, you have to look at Frank Netter, Netter's work. He is a surgeon who's also an anatomist.
Phenomenal artist.
Illustrator. It's just breathtaking. So when you see in someone your size or my size, let's say we're medium strong guys, psoas is a muscle that's that thick that spans over 7 or 8 inches of the front of the longer spine.
I forgot what the cut of beef the psoas is, but I remember it's quite a tasty one.
It's the fillet. It's a high fillet steak. But in a quadruped, that's a muscle that has massive volume, but it has little tension in it because it does little work. All it does is pull the leg back to the starting position of the gait. But in human beings, this is not true. It's much more than that, and it's also your diaphragm in a human being attaches to the front of psoas, and psoas has a continuous attachment to quadratus lumborum, which is where most people's back pain is experienced. So There is the fundamental emotional connection between breathing, tension, and a part of your body that you can't work. We've had people stretch psoas, which is the second or third part of the hip flexor stretch that we show free on YouTube. We've had people get up off the floor and just burst into tears for no reason. And then I remember one woman she is a dancer in Vancouver. She burst into tears and she was just distraught for about 30 seconds. Then it passed, just like, a breath of wind on a pond, just rippling the water. And she just looked at me and she looked at the whole group and she said, "My niece was run over by a car 2.5 years ago. I've not been able to feel anything in my body for the last 2.5 years," which of course you can imagine created immense problems in her relationships. And she said, "I've just felt my body for the first time." And she then relaxed completely and she said, "I've just realised it's all okay."
Wow.
And she had a complete transformation just in the space of 30 seconds.
So
it was the most amazing thing to see. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone who, our readers and listeners are going to have the same experience. In fact, the more you try to preempt some sort of cathartic experience, the less likely it is to happen. You have to do what I was suggesting to our previous questioner: simply pay attention to what's happening now, without any of yourself in it. It's not a question of, "I want this, I'm doing this activity to make this happen." No, you're doing this and watching to see what happens. That's all. Being open to what might happen. That's all.
So, the most effective technique in your approach would be this for releasing emotional blockages.
Yes. Unquestionably. Look, basically, psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychology is based on the assumption that in Freud's case, it was the recreation of the trauma via the talking about the trauma and the re-experiencing of that trauma in the safe environment of a psychotherapist's couch, that the trauma itself would be transformed. But Wilhelm, in his assertion that neurosis is identical to muscular tension, provides a completely separate and, I would say, non-invasive and much more palatable approach than having someone talk to you about your potty training or your relationship with your mother, or the traumas that you've experienced, or trying to recreate the birth trauma experience. You don't need to go down that road. You don't need to use anything exotic or in any way airy-fairy. You have your physical body right in front of you, and this is why I was saying recently about the first Satipatthana, that sutta in Buddhism. The body is the first foundation of mindfulness because it's there with you all the time, and because you can't escape it, and because right in it is all of the trauma that you're talking about. It's there, just waiting to be gently exposed.
So Elliot Hulse is kind of a guy who's popularized Wilhelm Reich's approach with bioenergetic breathing, and rapid breathing and lots of tapping, screaming, and sort of jumping up and down on the heels and opening up those channels. Is that an approach that you've tried with people, or something that you'd recommend?
It's I've had to play around with some of those things, and I'm familiar with his work. I'm just going to fall back on what I suggested before. I mean, you can play with those things, and if they resonate, and I use that word deliberately, if they resonate in your body, then go with them. But what I'm talking about, the postulation of the bioenergetic pathways, is not even necessary. In other words, if we apply Occam's razor, which as you know, and I know a little bit about, Eric postulated the existence of all sorts of other things which in my systems is not necessary to know about, which no doubt, though, supervene on them, and so are affected by them. You see what I'm getting
Sure.
at? By only concentrating on range of movement, which is something that has no emotional content for most people. It's not considered threatening. It doesn't ask you to, as I said, deal with your potty training. It doesn't require you to scream, any of those things. You simply find out where in your body you cannot release tension from voluntarily, and apply the techniques that soften that area, and I'm just going to repeat, and see what happens. Because trauma, this is so critical to understand, trauma is embodied. It does not exist outside of the body. Now, some therapists regard trauma as being embodied in the physical structure of the brain and the mind. Our position is that because the brain, or the mind I should say, and the body are isomorphic, in other words, what's going on in the body is going on and mirrored perfectly in the mind, just as thinking about something creates the same reaction in the body. I'll give you a perfect example. You're at home, you had a drink of a glass of wine or two, you're with your loved one, romance is in the air, you're feeling wonderful. You've heard the story. And the phone rings. No drama, you walk over to the phone, you're still feeling lovely and light, and, the anticipation of the next, few hours of pleasure with your loved one, or even just being completely peaceful and relaxed with your loved one, and you pick up the phone, and it's your hated father-in-law. And in the instant, it takes a fraction of a second, about 1/10, 2/10 of a second, in the instant of hearing the hated father-in-law's voice, your body literally organizes itself into hated father-in-law mode, or posture, or position, or shape. Now, the crazy thing about the hated father-in-law, he's in an insane asylum in Helsinki. You are completely safe. There is no way he can affect you in any way. He lives 5,000 miles away from you, let's say we're in Australia. But nonetheless, the sound of the voice literally recreates the experience.
So
now what more evidence do you need than that to talk about this connection between the mind and the body, and why working on the body is the recommended and safe and least threatening way, and you can take your time with it.
This is why I love this approach, because although it challenges swathes of psychotherapy and everything, but it's empirically testable, and it happens. You witness it every day when you speak to the father-in-law, or when something like that happens. Now, to bring that to some kind of application, let's say you go into father-in-law mode when you answer the phone, and your shoulders rise, and you prepare for like a cat does for a fight. What would be, so let's say before that.
Okay, stop. I'll tell you.
Okay.
Thanks for asking that question. Look, the whole work that we do, and this I haven't spoken about this. It's not a new thought for me, but it is new to actually talk about this publicly. It's not obvious, but the worthwhileness of our work is one thing. It's simply to generate more options in the moment. Now, I know this sounds like a bit of a stretch, if you'll excuse the pun, but let me explain what I mean. Working on your body, working on the sensations in your body, necessarily brings you into the present. If you recall our recent conversation, physical sensations are momentary and only exist in the present. They don't exist in the future, they don't exist in the past, they can never be recreated. It's always the mind that does the recreation of the physical sensation, but the body doesn't do it by itself. Right? It's the mind processing the sound of the voice that creates the sensation. It's not the impingement on the auditory nerve that causes the... Do you get what I'm saying? So when you have done enough of this kind of work, you'll find that in the instant of hearing the hated father-in-law's voice, you will have the wherewithal, the actual capacity, to choose an alternative option in the moment. And what you do, it's simple, you let your tummy go completely soft. Now, it's not an obvious thing, but you cannot get angry, you can't get upset while your tummy is soft. What happens though is the movement to anger, or whatever other movement is appropriate, or at least you feel it, or not even appropriate, whatever other movement's hardwired into your system for the hated father-in-law, instead of you automatically and at warp speed moving into that reflexive response, there's space there, and this happens, or the capacity to exercise an option is incredibly small space. But the more you're in tune with the present, the more you actually live in the present, the larger that space becomes.
That's answered the question then, because I think the father-in-law issue is different to, I guess, the other processes you've mentioned, which is resting tension all the time. That's the accumulation of these traumas or these things that have happened, relative to, in this case, you have, let's say you're walking around with relaxed traps, and then only when the trigger comes in did they tense up. So you're saying it's not so much about having done stretching work on that area, it's more that you've built the awareness over time so that when a trigger does come up and the tension arises, you can smooth it earlier and earlier?
It's actually both. It's very, very hard to develop awareness without that having an overall muscle tonus reducing effect anyway. You've been on my workshops. I'll always say to participants, just come over and feel my body, feel what it feels like. And you might recall, I don't know whether you actually did, but most people do, and my body's completely soft. Even when I'm standing up, moving around, walking around, it's soft.
I think there's a picture of me actually feeling your spine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
and it's soft, and it's just that's not normal. But what it gives me is, or what it has led to, and this is where this awareness comes from, is that my body, I won't say there's a delay in responding, because I can get angry in the space of a heartbeat just like anyone else. But unlike most people, and I should actually mention where that idea of a heartbeat came from, I might mention that later, we'll just see. But because I'm actually feeling what's happening in my body all the time, I can feel my body organizing itself to get angry. And because I can feel that, the actual process starting, I can relax my tummy and just say no.
Stop it from spiraling.
Yes. Because it's a reflex. Not only does it spiral, it intensifies, and this happens in about, well, you ask yourself, or any of our listeners ask yourself, when you suddenly get angry, how long does it take? It's less than half a second. It's less than half a second. So you haven't got a lot of time to work with here. And so the closer and closer you come in contact with what's happening in your physical body, it's not so much that the whole body becomes soft. That's a byproduct, I think, but that's also true. It is that you are aware. I can speak from anger because that's always been the emotion that's had the most negative effect in my life, and of course on the people around me too, is that when you become more in tune with what's going on in your body, and I should also add, this can be done completely by interoception, it can be done completely by sitting meditating, it can be done completely by lying relaxation, it can be done completely by only working on what look like stretching exercises. They all yield the same result. But you will feel that the body setting itself up to become angry has a pattern that's unique to you, and it is always the same. As one of my teachers used to say, you've got a PhD in upset. What I mean is that no matter what your emotional blockage or problem is, whether it's grief or melancholy or anger or any of the other negative emotions, anyone who has that has practiced it 10,000 times, and as we know, 10,000 times is the key to mastery. But unfortunately, this mastery is the major blight in your life.
It's an undesirable mastery.
Yes, and most mastery is undesirable mastery, because most mastery is unconscious. As soon as you start to bring awareness to the problem, as soon as you start to see and feel, and I would say feel is the more important thing, these things happening, all of a sudden you have options. Do I get on that train when I know where it goes, or not? Or do I just say, you are aware of the anger, you let your tummy relax completely, and you say, Henrik, what a pleasure it is to hear from you. What can I do for you today? And if you get to that point of having the capacity to simply interrupt what is just a completely motivationless, reflexive response, the body, remember, there's no malice to this. It's simply something you've learned. It's a pattern you literally have created yourself, even though we don't think of it that way. As soon as you have the first experience of being able to interrupt that, everything changes for you. Now, it's not to say that you won't get angry in the future. If you talk to Olivia, she'll tell you I get angry all the time about different things. But I will say, and I don't know whether she'd agree with this or not, but it passes much more quickly. The ephemeral nature of it, the way it was explained to me, and this was so liberating and so helpful for me to hear this, a teacher I was working with at the time said, I made the remark, we'd had quite a few cognacs at this point and we were being really open and honest with each other, and I said, I'm really looking forward to the time in my own, development. I know it's not a development because we're not acquiring anything, but we're actually taking things away, but we talk about this process. I'm looking forward to the time when I'm not angry all the time. And he just looked at me and he said, why? And I said, it tastes horrible. It's really damaging to me. It's ghastly for the people I'm among. He said, yeah, of course I know all that. He said, let me tell you about the time that the rishis spoke of, the time they spoke of before the Vedas were written, when the great beings walked the earth. The great beings were angry for the space of 2 or 3 heartbeats. And that became my goal. I could see straight away when that story was told to me, because this guy, Leo Lamalea, said to me, some people are angry for 2 or 3 heartbeats, some are angry for 2 or 3 days, some 2 or 3 weeks, and some their whole life. And the point is, we do actually get a choice if we're aware of this. But if you're only ever behaving reflexively, by definition, there's no awareness there. So as you become aware of the changes manifesting, whatever they are, over time, and as your awareness and concentration is also important here too, strengthens, then the capacity to interrupt the process arises. You become aware that it's possible not to do that, and you choose not to do it.
So I'm sure people listening are thinking, at the start I was convinced of stretching just even if all it did was to make me more flexible, and now this is like the benefits that you would get would be to have this completely unimpeded flow where you're angry for 2 or 3 heartbeats as the ultimate goal. And Al is asking, what is the first of all, what's the minimum effective dose in terms of weekly routine, but should you then target a specific muscle area, or should you attack the whole system? And then he's got another question later about application, about periodization as well.
Okay. Well, let me just look at the time. It's already nearly midday. Firstly, and I say this from my own personal experience, and experience I can talk from after all, in my body, but this is not true for Olivia's body, in my body, the acquisition of the experience of serenity in the body was absolutely the major step. In fact, all of my flexibility gains have come as a result of having that experience in my body. And that experience came, you could say, partly from stretching, but it came far more from doing the lying relaxation practices, which, as you know, are free from our website, and simply experiencing in time what being deeply relaxed actually feels like, because there's no point in saying to someone relax when they actually don't have that experience in their body. And as I mentioned the other day, our forebears are the most efficient creators of the fight or flight reflex in the history of the planet, and that's our skill set, unfortunately. And so to acquire that parasympathetic nervous system response, that experience of serenity and deep relaxation in the body, for certain members of our audience will be the most immensely useful first step. But having said that, if that's not a practice that appeals to you, and it's not a practice that appeals to Olivia, for example, then working on the flexibility exercises will definitely get you part, if not all the way there, and they may well take you all the way there. The thing that you can concentrate on whole body if you want. I think that's essential to do that in the beginning, because no matter how well you think you know your body, you will be an expert at avoiding stretching the places in your body that actually need stretching. And you've seen this on the workshop. I'll say to someone, okay, get into this position, and you will see the most creative interpretation of that position, because each person knows exactly how horrible that's going to feel if they do it properly. So they don't. They turn their hips, or they roll their leg, or do whatever. And so you need to work with someone. You need to work with someone who can, in the process of stretching the whole body over a period of weeks or whatever it is, identify which are your tightest and most blocked lines, and they're the ones you concentrate on. Because there is no doubt, in my experience, that working on your tightest lines yields the best bang for the buck, if we can be instrumental in thinking about it this way. If we're thinking about what is the practice, what's the structure of my practice that will give the best results for the least amount of effort spent, identifying your tight spots and changing those will give you that best bang for the buck. As for frequency, let your body be the guide for that. There are some people like me who get the late onset muscle soreness after every strength training workout and after every stretching workout, and there are other people who've never experienced DOMS in any form. My strong suggestion is, if you give yourself the schedule or permission of stretching 1 decent session a week or 2 decent stretching sessions a week, if you're really serious, don't rush it, take your time, do the rest of your training as well, and in 6 months' time you won't recognize yourself. If you combine that with the lying relaxation as well, it's an amplifying effect.
Right. Thank you. So Kit, I'm aware that you need to go and have your breakfast, so shall we run through the final questions, just rapid fire, and wrap things up?
Yeah.
Cool. So Al says, should a flexibility program be periodized, or should it be run alongside a sports practice if the goal is performance?
Okay. The idea, periodization, and the concept sport practice, both are concepts. Flexibility exists in the realm of the body, and it's pre-conceptual. Your task, Al, should you decide to accept it, is to learn to feel what's happening in your own body. And then questions of periodization and sports performance will be irrelevant. You'll feel exactly how often, how deeply to stretch and when not to. The body becomes a self-regulating mechanism if you... Look, what we say in the workshops is the body is talking to you all the time, but we're either deaf to what it's saying or we don't understand the language. The language of the body is sensation, and only sensation. There is nothing else. Sensation is the exhaustive language of the body. There's nothing else. How well can you feel your body? And when you start to go into it, most people can't feel their body at all. In fact, they've got a very strong vested interest in not feeling their body because their body is hurting them a lot of the time. And that ranges from the fully injured and incapacitated through to people who just say, I'm not going to get up and walk around because I need to have this finished by the time I leave work today. That's how good we are at separating ourselves from what's happening in the body. So the primary utility of any flexibility routine is relearning to hear, to experience the sensations in your own body. Now, once you do start to experience the sensations in your own body, then the idea of periodization becomes irrelevant, because when I go to stretch today or tomorrow, I feel, this is still sore from the other day. I do something else. You come back to it 2 or 3 days after that, I feel exactly how this feels now. I take a breath in, I can go deeper, I'll do the contractions, look, new range of movement. You, the alleged owner of the body, cannot control the process. We like to say working with the body is like working with a wild animal. No sudden noises, don't try to make it do what it doesn't want to do, and no sudden movements. If you follow those rules and start to listen and to feel what's happening inside your body, all conceptual understanding of how to work with the body will literally evaporate.
So it all comes down to, again, cultivating awareness of the body and working with it rather than applying a structure.
Yep.
Cool. So I suppose, again, you've kind of answered this too. Al said, what is the biggest mistake that people make when trying to get flexible? And what's the most common bad advice out there in the fitness industry on flexibility?
Well, that's easy to answer. Periodization and specificity for sport performance. Do you get what I'm saying? Those are conceptual perspectives on the body. The body does not exist in the conceptual realm. The body exists only in the continuously unfolding present, and only by tapping into its sensations can you understand what's happening inside it. Having said that, if we approach it at a more mundane level, the tightest areas in your body should be stretched no more than once a week, and for some people could be as much as once every 10 days or even once every 2 weeks is appropriate. And the reason for assessing appropriateness is basically the first time you stretch your hamstring muscles properly, you'll be sore for a week. I promise you that's true. So what's the point in trying to stretch something that's actually really physically sore? There's no advantage to it at all. But in our system we distinguish between limbering and stretching. Limbering is the modern or the old-fashioned way of describing mobility. Limbering is simply recapturing yesterday's range of movement, and so everyone should be doing some limbering. I mean, when we go to the park, that's exactly what we do. Stretching, on our definition, is actually obtaining momentarily new range of movement by a raft of means, and that will leave you feeling sore. So once again, you need to be tuning into what your body is telling you to be able to calibrate the dose. Remember that sliding along the edge of a razor blade, using your balls as rudder and brake? Not enough, too much? Like Silas and Charybdis? That's what we're talking about. That is the fineness of your discrimination has to be that level. Eventually, of course it can't happen overnight, but the more you practice these things, the clearer this insight and this understanding and this connection becomes.
Excellent. The final two questions, Kit, were: if I had £100 to spend on tools for getting flexible, what should I buy? Apart from your books, of course.
I would say spend, well, I can't remember how much Master the Full Squat is. I think it's about £10, isn't it?
I think so.
I'd start there. Well, let's say, okay, blow the budget, spend £10, get Master the Full Squat, because there are quite a large number of what we call relatively small muscle group or small movement things in that, which are not directly related to the squat movement itself, but which don't really fit well in the Master the Pancake or Master the Pike or Master the Full Back Bend. So we recommend to everyone that they start with Master the Squat, and then you decide how to spend your money after that. So that the risk is small. I think it's £10 for that program. Or you could simply spend some time on the YouTube channel, which is free. If you're not, there's an exercise there which is called the lunge hamstring stretch, and it actually contains a brief description and practice of a set of movements which talks about the three reflexes we use, with the three reflexes that we manipulate that yield more flexibility in the body. It's a free thing. I think the program is 6 or 7 minutes long. You should measure your toe touching capacity before doing that on both legs, and then measure your toe touching capacity after doing that. And if you're not convinced by then this method's not going to work for you.
Okay, so the next question, Kit, was: if I had £100 to spend on tools for getting flexible, what should I buy?
Well, I wouldn't spend £100. I would spend £10 or whatever it is. I can't remember the price of. I think it's about £10. I'd spend £10 on Master the Full Squat, and then if you decide you like the approach and that you get some benefit out of that, then you can decide to go in any of the other 4 directions that are available from there. Our programs are not expensive, and the reason why I recommend starting with Master the Full Squat, and I would make that recommendation even if you've got an excellent bodyweight squat, and that's because there are a bunch of small exercises which don't fit any of the other 4 programs which I decided to put into Master the Full Squat and which are necessary for full hip mobility. So start there and then decide where to go after that. You know, you might just spend 20 quid and find that you've got enough, or alternatively buy Master the Full Squat for 10 quid, so that if I had kids they'd be thanking you. I'd send them to college, on all the money, but we don't have kids, but I like the money anyway. But what I was going to suggest was, instead you could go to YouTube, and if you went to, for example, an exercise called lunge hamstring, you will find a succinct explanation of the entirety of our approach, including mention of the 3 reflexes that we manipulate in order to become more flexible. And that exercise itself is the best hamstring exercise on the planet. If you follow the directions, if you do a toe touching test before you do that exercise and then do a toe touching test afterwards, I guarantee that 5 minutes will make you more flexible instantly.
And although it is £10, if you are afraid of sinking the money, obviously the YouTube channel is testament to the amount of quality and the amount of stuff that's available there. And really the paid products, and I'm selling your stuff here, Kit, but
thank you.
The paid products are they really are over delivery. And I remember you saying, I think it was on the last podcast, that you artificially keep the price down so as not to not to punish those who can't afford it and reward those who can. So
look. We had a donation button on our website which no one used. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Not one person donated a fucking penny to us, and that's okay. But having said that, let me explain the philosophy behind our work. As you know, none of our programs have any kind of digital rights management system or anything like that. Once you download it, you can do what you like with it. And to be honest, we just regard that as free advertising. If you send them to your friends, please ask them to buy something at some point. But if you have a friend who's poor, or you just want to send something to them that you think would be useful to them, we don't mind that at all. It's not any kind of a problem for us, because without going into all the sort of theoretical perspectives on economic modelling, the one thing that is true in this instance is that the space that we're working in is infinitely large. If you have an internet connection and you have the capacity to discriminate, you will quickly be able to work out that most of the stuff that's available on the internet is shite or useless, or just some bendy, beautiful young lady, dressed in lycra and with a low-cut top, showing you how to do side splits, it won't actually help you do side splits at all. It will not improve your lateral flex or your hip abduction capacity one iota. But all of our material will actually transform your flexibility in time, providing you do the work. And we have the forums available too, and I know you know all about them, but the forums are simply text-based, and also there are images there too and links to videos, but it is the single best, most complete compendium of information that's available on stretching anywhere on the internet, and it's free. If you want to post yourself, if you want to ask a question, if you say, look, I've got this particular problem and I need to modify an exercise this way, someone will answer. And what's more, the standard of discourse there is sober, intelligent and interesting, and people are polite to each other. I was going to say we've not deleted a single post. I did delete one post, and that was the post where the advice was given to do a couple of lines of cocaine to someone that had he had some blockages in his nasal system. And I wrote to this guy and said, look, you little fucker, that's not the advice that we give for all sorts of different reasons. And to his credit, the guy came back and said, look, mate, I really was only kidding. And I said, look, I know you're only joking. That's okay. And he's continued to be a useful contributor to the forum. So he's the only one. We do not edit things. We don't delete things. We don't censor things. We don't.
It's a very rare thing for an online forum for there not to be trolling and flaming and all that stuff.
We don't need to. We don't need to, because there are no trolls there and no flamers. And I remember, I think we discussed this once before, but I found that I was banned from a forum. You might know whose forum I'm talking about, Coach Sommer's forum, because all of a sudden, when I went to look at something that I'd written the day before, and I was going to amplify a post that I'd made there, I found that my IP address had been banned by his system. It was very amusing. I joined a rather select group of people who've been banned from his forums, and all of my posts were deleted as well. So we learnt a lot from that, and the big thing that we learnt is that censorship just doesn't work. I mean, on Reddit, if you go onto Reddit, for example, and Google our names, you'll see there's a whole discussion about the different ways of doing the things that we do. And as you know, I apply the 50-year test to everything. In my world, if I need to make a decision about something, I ask myself, who'll care in 50 years? Who'll give a fuck in 50 years, actually, is how the test actually runs. And so far, the answer to every question has been, well, no one. In which case, we fall back on what I call the second order decision-making process, which is very simply expressed: we decide in favour of the course of action that will bring the greatest amount of good to the greatest number of people who are involved in whatever it is that we're talking about. Very simple.
I think if the content brings in the right type of traffic, then as you do with the forum, you're very laissez-faire, and it brings in very intelligent arguments on both sides, and you're often you're open to any of that, and there's hours worth of reading. I remember I had a long train journey across the country, and the forums certainly kept me entertained the whole time. So lots of stuff. I've
learned things from the forums. If you have an explicitly open learning system, which we do, then because you're not spending your energy on protecting your barriers. I mean, let's face it, anyone who knows anything only knows a tiny fraction of the whole. And so I realized this a long time ago, because we can't know everything, we have to take the opposite stance. We actually have to be completely permeable. We have to let people take our material, and we hope that we'll get information in return that will be useful to the larger enterprise, which is how to achieve grace and ease in the body. And I assure you that in the time that the forums have been running, and of course all the classes that we ran at the university for the 20 odd years before that, that approach has borne 1,000 times the dividends of the investment that we made originally.
I'm sure, it's great marketing, even though it's not a strategy per se, it's just a foundational assumption, but it gives rise to intelligent debate, and I'm sure once people get a taste of the content, they think, right, I'm going to dive in.
Yeah. So next question?
Next question was, what is the best exercise for getting good at downward dog?
Oh, that's a piece of cake. That one's actually the simplest. I will say downward dog, and I can't remember what the name is in Sanskrit. It'll come to me. But downward dog is basically an exercise in ankle flexibility and also exercise in the capacity of the sciatic nerve to exit the intervertebral foramina and at the same time deal with the flexion of the hips and at the same time deal with the dorsiflexion of the ankle, which places the sciatic nerve under the greatest stretch it can experience. So we have an exercise called the single leg dog pose, and that's available free on YouTube. It's actually a sample exercise from one of our programs. I can't remember which one, doesn't matter. And Olivia is demonstrating it and using the ladder bars, but you can use a wall to do the same thing. And that single leg downward dog will give you the flexibility in the ankles and the length in both the hamstrings and the sciatic nerve to be able to do the full downward dog in time. The full downward dog, if you Google it on YouTube, I have never seen a single individual do it properly. Now when I do single leg downward dog, my back is a gentle extension from sacrum to my fingertips, and that includes shoulder flexion. My heels are on the ground and my feet are about 8 or 10 inches apart. That's what the two-legged downward dog would look like. Now I haven't done the two-legged downward dog for quite some time, but I used to be able to do it perfectly. But the secret is ankle flexibility, basically.
Cool. Well, that is all of the questions. Kit, thanks for your patience with running through all of these. And if you want to check out more of Kit, then check out the podcasts. We have a previous episode where we go over the general philosophy. Yeah. Also look at the coffee shop conversations with Dave Wardman from Physical Alchemy. And there's also a number of podcasts on Kit's website, stretchtherapy.net. Check out the YouTube channel as well, a huge repository of free stuff on there. So if you're not convinced about any of the programs, all they do is they put it together into an order. And so I'm sure it'll be enough for you to get on with to begin with. Finally, I can't recommend Kit's workshops enough. I went to the one in London last year, and it just went top to toe, 2 days, and it was just a full handbook of stuff to go away and get started with.
It was fun, and I know you know this, but I'm just going to mention it because other people who are listening have not had the experience. The workshop experience is unique, and the actual level of communication and understanding that can occur in that 2 days of what's effectively a pressure cooker environment can lift your own performance immensely. You might remember the number of breakthroughs that different people had on that workshop.
Massively.
People, it's incredible. Some people have been working for years and trying to siege a particular problem, not being able to do it. What happens is when you get a group of people and a collective energetic mass happens, something else that we do not understand well happens. And I'm not just saying this to sell the workshops. If you look at the testimonials on our site from people who've attended just a single workshop, they're just breathtakingly strong. We don't invent any of that stuff. That's what people actually write back to us. For example, a woman today, a Pilates teacher, wrote to Olivia this morning and said in her work she needs to attend workshops and upskill and all the rest of it, keep in touch with the latest developments in her field. She said, I've been attending workshops regularly for 14 years, and she said, hands down, your workshop's the best I've ever been to. Now, it's embarrassing. There's two things I think, well, shit, the average standard of workshops can't be all that high. And then on the other hand, maybe I'm undervaluing our own work too, because I do know that a number of really amazing things always happen on the workshops, and I'm honestly just so grateful for the opportunity to do what the Buddha calls right action, or right livelihood actually. We are so fortunate, Olivia and I, to be able to teaching, and this is true for you too, teaching things which are useful to other people and which do not rip other people off. We don't need to make someone else poorer in order for us to be richer. Collectively, and this is not just an idea to me, this is our whole life. We just simply need to be and want to be useful to other people. And there are a number of different ways that we have of actually getting traction on that idea. Presenting workshops and travelling around the world and doing things in different places is actually really hard on us physically, and we don't actually enjoy travelling. If you've travelled recently, you know exactly what it's like. It's not a pleasant experience. The idea of, quote, the romance of travel, well, that died back in the 1930s, I think. That's been a long, long time since anyone said, well, that's actually a relaxing, exciting experience. It normally takes at least a week to recover from an overseas trip of 2 or 3 months. But at the same time, I can say honestly, there is no activity in my life where I feel more alive than when we're challenged by people and where we are actually involved in the opening up of their bodies and the complete demolishing of ideas that they have about their own limitations and their own ideas of what they can and can't do. Not in any forceful way. You know how we work. It's very gentle, but it's transforming, and I feel honestly, truly blessed to have found this way of making a living. It's just great.
And that's very true in the way that the workshops are run. I mean, there's a strict capacity limit for how many people can do it, so that you can maintain that ratio of facilitators to attendance.
We have to. The biggest number that we have ever taught anywhere, I think, is about, from memory, it's about 37 people. I remember I went to a Thomas Myers workshop once in Australia, and there were 170 people in this workshop. It's absurd. Or I know some of the yoga workshops are also huge.
I've seen some massive ones, yeah.
Well, you're looking at two big screens. There's a video camera on the presenter who's a dot in the far distant background, and you're interacting with this person via a video screen. It's not real. We do make money from our workshops, and our workshops are middle of the road price-wise, but we do enough of them so that we make enough money to pay our mortgage and all those other kinds of things. But we want people to have a life-changing experience on those workshops. If they're open to it, they will have one.
Great. Well, Kit, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming back on, despite the connection issues that we had. And how can we find out more about you and access you? Is there anything I've missed there in the stretch therapy and forums?
I think, look, the name, you can put the name of our website up. It's stretchtherapy.net. Anyone that goes onto that website, there's lots of free articles there. There's links to all of the relaxation scripts. There's links to all of the podcasts that you talked about, and this one will be up there too as soon as you send it to me. All the workshop schedule is up. For example, London, next year's workshop schedule is already up. We're going to add one to it. We're going to do a stretch therapy for performance workshop as well, which is not currently listed, but it will be within the next week or so. And yeah, this is interesting. I want to talk about this for a moment, just for a second. We have almost no American or Canadian members of our forum. And the reasons we think are extremely interesting. The vast majority of forum members are non-English speaking people. I mean, they speak English, but English is not their first language. The majority are Europeans, Italians, Swedes, Norwegians, Danes, everywhere else on the continent, and English people, Scottish people, Irish people. And that's fascinating to me, because although I had an O1 visa. It was very difficult to get visa for America. It's this sort of unlimited work visa. You come and go as you please. Very hard to get. But even though I taught there for 10 years, we hardly got any traction in the American market. Our work actually requires you to think about it. Now, I don't want to imply that Americans don't think, but there is definitely the iPhone generation. If I can talk about the momentum and trajectory of that generation, the Facebook using group seems to be, the Americans and Canadians seem to fit that group much more than they fit the way we do things. The work that we're doing actually requires that you pay attention to what's happening. You must learn to concentrate. You can't do this work unless you do that. And it requires a level of awareness, which means that you actually have to let go of the ideas that you have about what and who you think you are. I mean, it sounds a bit radical, and a lot of people find that quite confronting, but at the same time, there is a huge number of people in the world who want to go beyond the surface appearance of things. So how do you do that? Well, unless you join a cult or do something else, it's very, very hard to do. It's very hard to access in normal daily life. But our work is all about grace and ease in the body and more efficient movement in daily life. I like to say on workshops, when I'm teaching meditation workshops, I say, look, anyone can be a saint if they live on a mountaintop and get fed by the villagers every day, and once a week you make these wise pronouncements. But as a teacher that I worked with for many years said, you think you're enlightened? Go and stay a week with your family.
Mm-hmm.
That's getting traction. If you are growing, that experience will be immensely revealing to you, and what's more, you may be able to stay a week with your family without the normal things happening that happen in families. But not many people can do that. And we're interested in differences that make a difference while still being in the secular world.
I remember so you said earlier that Olivia, you felt like Olivia's role in your life is to point out your unresolved points and your weaknesses so that you can grow into them. That's an idea from David Dada, The Way of the Superior Man. I don't know whether you were referring to that, but where he says the role of the feminine, which may or may not be a woman in a relationship, is to do that, to highlight the points where a man is not living his fullest potential and cause him to grow into that.
Well, Olivia, I can say she's got a PhD in pointing out. She's too good at it sometimes, but then again, because we both have a commitment to actually paying attention to what's happening rather than what we think is happening. I know that's something that I've stressed again and again in this podcast. Because we really have a commitment to that, it's not just an ideal for us, it's actually how we live each day. An intimate relationship is the pressure cooker environment for growth if you can take the heat. What happens in most relationships is you reach a point where there's a blow up and it's easier just to walk away from it, or there's a blow up and you end up the person whom you loved only five minutes ago. The person whom you loved only 5 minutes ago, suddenly you reconstruct only their negative points into the image of the person that I'm so angry about or angry with that I'm going to separate from the relationship. Isn't that a kind of insanity? It seems like it is to me. And so Olivia and I have decided, well, we would really like to grow. In fact, on that point, let me just make this point. Many people will tell you in conversation, if you ask them what they're interested in, they'll say, well, I'm interested in personal growth. And it's become quite fashionable to say that. So one of my teachers said, look, are you interested in personal growth? That's the question. And the person responds, yes. And then the teacher then identifies the most deeply ingrained habit you have. Let's say it's drinking too much alcohol, or maybe you like to smoke too many spliffs, or whatever it is. But or you eat too much of the wrong kind of food, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Or you don't do any exercise, blah, blah, whatever. And the teacher says, okay, you say you want to grow. Okay, this habit you have, like with my brother, for example, he won't mind me mentioning this, it's drinking gin. It's not good for him. It's bad for his skin, actually. And so I said, because he asked if he could become a student of mine, and I said, look, that's a big responsibility, you asking that question. It's not something, I've had one student before, Dave, who's grown immensely, and that was, we were very closely involved with each other for a long time, 7 years. But my brother said, look, I really want to learn something about this stuff too. And I said, okay, so gin. Are you prepared to give up gin for 3 months? And he just went quiet, very quiet. And I said, well, that's what personal growth is about. It's actually about giving up the things that you hold most dear. And when most people are faced with that choice, most people realize, oh, I see. I like the idea of growth. It's an attractive idea, but actually I don't want to do what's necessary to grow. And if you really want to grow, and this is so hard, but if you really want to grow, you have to contrive the circumstances, and this is where Olivia plays a vital role in my own life. You contrive the circumstances so that your actual behavior is reflected back to you. And we work together as well as live together, so it's a 24/7 blowtorch, if you want to put it that way. But it's great.
It's interesting you say that. I think there's a lot of projection tactics that we take to avoid the just the consistent application of the basics. And it's a topic that we write about occasionally, saying that optimization is masturbation, trying to fine-tune the kind of higher level stuff before you've got the basics under control, especially with diet. And I think that's the biggest one that people are worrying about: meal timing and leucine pulsing and how much amino acids they're having around their workout, and they're not tracking their average weekly calories week on week. No. It's like, forget all that stuff. You're wasting your time.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely accurate. When we were running those classes we ran at the university for 27 years, I ran the advanced class there for 26 years out of the 27. Whenever I was in town, I'd teach the advanced class. And to my students' surprise, I'd go back to the basics, the real basics, every 6 or 8 weeks. But then the light came on one day, and somebody said to me, I can't remember who it was, and she said, I've just felt something in this exercise that I know I can do well that I've never felt before. What's going on? And I said, well, see how you can actually move around in this position? Now, in this position, for most people, that's it. The tension in the body is so strong I can't do anything. I can only just try as best I can to relax in the face of that sensory assault. Because you've got the range of movement beyond the requirement of this exercise, now you can start to play with this movement. That's the gold. And so in anyone who's involved, for example, in your world in strength training, or
well, you see expert powerlifters doing a technique day, or even monks that have been meditating for 20 years, they still go back to counting the breath, for example.
Look, absolutely. In fact, I have a Roshi friend who said to me, I mean, I've done this for longer than he has now, but he said, I did only breath counting for 14 years. And I said to him, look, Paul his name is, and I said, Paul, mate, I still breath count, and I've been meditating for, as long as him. It must be nearly 30 years now. And do I regard that as any kind of I'm a failure, I'm going back to beginner's practice? No. If you want to calibrate your practice, the basic, well, even the most exotic visualizations in Tibetan Buddhism are predicated on mastery of the basics. So how do you know whether you've mastered the basics? Don't fucking think about it. Go back and try them. I just lost count at breath 66. Guess what? You're not paying attention. No problem. But you have to know the fruits of your practice. And not as an idea, not as a concept. If you set yourself up as a master or a guru, and this is particularly poignant and powerful in my own world, I think I've successfully resisted every attempt of my students to elevate me in some way. Mate, I am when I say I'm a beginner, I mean that. I am a beginner. I have some understanding of the problem set, and I can usually offer some advice to other people as to how to improve their own range of movement, but I do not think for one moment I'm an expert of any kind. It just happens, though, that we know a bit more than most people who call themselves experts.
Well, I think that's just a scientific approach. It's that, in the light of new evidence, we change our opinion and there's no ego involved. We just have to accept the new... And I guess the definition of guru status, at least in the fitness industry, is the people that will relentlessly hold on to an old, bashed up idea that has been frequently disproved by study upon study, but because they've invested their identity into being the low-carb guy or being the whatever... then they get stuck in their ideas and they have to dig their heels in.
And what we're really talking about here is how the ego will take any measures to defend itself. Just look at Donald Trump. I mean, he is a perfect example of a narcissistic misogynist who should never be in that role, but it's perfect because he is a perfect reflection of that fundamental schizophrenia of that culture. Anyway, as you said yesterday, which made me laugh, that remark was a bit off-piste, but nonetheless relevant. If you are actually interested in growing, and if you find yourself believing your own publicity, you've just disappeared up your own ass. And this is the important thing, more growth can't happen. And for me personally, because I'm aware of the passing of time and I've got very little time left, there's still so many things that I want to learn. I can't actually allow that to happen. I won't allow it to happen.
To shut yourself off from further growth?
No. The opposite. I'm working harder to deepen my opening to further growth. That's what I'm working on.
Cool.
And it's not easy. But at the same time, what the fuck else are you going to do, for God's sake? Everything else is just a waste of time.
It was actually the reason that I decided to go into medicine. It was an Earl Nightingale quote, because I was working in finance at the time in Scotland, and it was, if you don't pursue your dream for fear of it taking too long, don't worry, the time will pass anyway.
Absolutely.
And I realised that
is true.
I'm just going to be 10 years older but suicidal working in finance rather than at least on my way to be a doctor. So,
or not,
and
it's okay, or not, and it's okay. This is to let go. Look, I don't know whether we had this conversation or whether it was someone else, but one of the absurdities of our culture is the cultivation of the fear of failure. I think we were talking about this, weren't we?
Yesterday.
No, you must embrace failure. Unless you embrace failure, failure is exciting because there is a certainty in failure. You know, this could apply to relationships or anything else. You know that this path that you'd been on, it actually, you know for sure, not by hearsay or some other method, you know for sure this doesn't work for you. Wow, that's gold, man. So you say I could put that aside. Is that wasted time? Absolutely not wasted time, because of the certainty and the closing of the gaps in Indra's net. You now have a quantum of clarity you did not have before.
You've gained data.
Yes, and if you do that 1,000 times, you absolutely will be closer to the trajectory you need to be on. And there's no doubt about that. And so in our school system, we reward success, which actually doesn't teach you anything. When you pass an exam, it doesn't teach you anything. And we discriminate strongly against failure. It should be the other way around. We should be rewarding failure and celebrating failure. I know it sounds really crazy to say that. Of course, that's not to say that there's not a desirable course of action that actually brings about the goals that you want to achieve. Of course, that's true. But the key to understanding precisely the nature and the shape and the taste of that is to fail.
And fail faster, like the book title.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Well, very good closing thoughts there, Kit. So I think we better wrap this up today. It would be great to chat at some point in the future as well. And
we will.
Looking forward to the London workshop.
Good. Well, look, one more thing. If your respondents who took the time and made the effort to actually ask the questions that we've been using as the structure for today's conversation, if they have follow-up questions, or that those questions or the answers are not satisfactory in any way at all, let's just have another chat about it. That's what we do. That I enjoy speaking to you, and I'm just very glad that other people seem to find our conversations interesting, because that's actually the genesis of what happened with Dave. The coffee shop conversations came about simply because Dave said, look, I've sieged your books, I've read all the articles that you've written, I've read everything you've posted, but the fact is, my greatest learning happened when you and I were sitting in coffee shops in Sydney and Melbourne and various other places, and we're just kibitzing about this, that and the other. And he said, then you told me about, this experience or that teacher you work with or something else. He said, that's the stuff that actually isn't noted anywhere. And it's true, it's not written about, because, God, if I ever find myself writing my own autobiography, I'll shoot myself first. But luckily, the interaction with people like you allows me to talk about these things, and also, too, to publicly express the deepest and immense gratitude that I have to the teachers that I've been blessed to interact with in this life. Because you can't plan this stuff. You can't. There are so many bullshitters out there. So I've been very lucky in that regard. I really have had some wonderful teachers, and I would say to any of your audience, if you are interested in deepening your understanding of any of these things, go and sit with someone or go and work with someone for a while and see what kind of person they are. Not the provenance of it's provenance, isn't it? Provenance of their teaching, who their teachers are, what PhDs they have, or any of that stuff. I mean, I did PhD research. I won an Australian Postgraduate Research Award. I had a dream run through the academic system, but it was actually my work in the limits to science. That's what my PhD work was about, and I worked in an area of logic, as you know. That's actually what took me back to Buddhism, because I realized that all of the important questions that I had, science had literally nothing to say about. And so I had this wide and deep understanding of science and also the limits to the scientific method, and I realized that that will not provide the sort of answers that most people are looking for when they say to themselves, God, I just want to see something a bit deeper than the appearance of this thing that I'm looking at.
Yes, this is something you see with physicists and mathematicians and logicians, where they kind of go full circle in this way and realize that studying the objective can't reveal anything about the subjective.
No. And in fact, the subjective is explicitly discriminated against, and yet, in the scientific method at least anyway, and yet for anyone listening, you'll know that your most important experiences, from the taste of the beer that you're going to have, or the sensation of holding your girlfriend or your boyfriend or whatever, none of those things can be understood by the scientific method. Here's my classic example. No description of the taste of an orange is the taste of the orange, except biting into one. Well, it's obvious when it's said, but it's not obvious when you think about it. Mm-hmm. So in our work, what we're trying to do is to get closer and closer to the direct experience of being human, not just ideas about being human. That's probably a good place to finish.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you so much.
Speechless on that. Kit, thank you very much, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you very much, Yusef. I look forward to seeing you again soon, man, really. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.